from the ones that I adore to the ones I mostly enjoy. Yeah, I'm gonna keep regretting that part throughout this entire series, aren't I? I hear a lot of good things about this game. It's peak Ratchet and Clank. There's so much to do. The story is amazing, the weapons are great. It goes on and on and on. The praise for Up Your Arsenal seems to be never-ending, be it from prominent YouTubers or just fans of the series. They mostly agree that this third game in the series does everything right, and it does it flawlessly. Maybe it's a bit hyperbolic of me to present it like that, but it honestly feels like there's this overwhelming positivity surrounding this game. I guess this is the point where I say that they're all wrong, right? That they're just high on nostalgia and are falsely injecting their childhood wonder into their opinions. But then even people new to the series seems to have a certain love for 3. Personally, I'm somewhere in the middle. I don't think Ouya, the Ratchet and Clank game, not the failed console, is the best Rat game ever, but I don't think it's a very bad game either. Don't get me wrong though, it's definitely the weakest in the series so far, and much of what made the second game inferior to the first game is starting to really rear its head this time around. There's something that has always mystified me about Sony and their consoles. Ever since they released the original PlayStation, I've always been in awe at how many games they've been able to pump out in a relatively short time. The Spyro series, 3 games in 3 years. Crash Bandicoot, 3 games in 3 years. Sly Cooper, 3 games in 4 years. Jak and Daxter, 3 games in 4 years. Ratchet and Clank, 3 games in 3 goddamn years. At one point you'd think that time itself would catch up to them and punish them for whatever sorcery they were using to slow it down, but somehow that never happened. At least not on the surface. It needs to be mentioned though that while the Sly series was developed by Sucker Punch, Crash and Jak were both developed by Naughty Dog, and Spyro and Ratchet were both developed by Insomniac, so at least 2 of these studios had some experience in developing games under a strict time limit. Whether or not that time limit was self-imposed or imposed by Sony, I can't 100% say, but something tells me it was most likely the latter. The reason I mention this is that while Ratchet and Clank 3 might seem like a perfectly good game on the surface, you don't have to dive very deep before you start to see the many cracks in its facade, and the duct tape that keeps it all together. And I think that the lack of time, or rather the mismanagement of time they had available, is mostly at fault for this. So let's talk about it. The first thing that comes to mind when you hear the names Ratchet and Clank, if you're familiar with the series, are most likely the many weapons available throughout the games, so let's start there. Ironically, the game titled Up Your Arsenal has the worst collection of weapons in the series so far. This seems to be a hot take for some reason, as the weapons are among what's praised the most. That being said, it's the entire lineup as a whole I don't like, thanks to various things that we'll go over later, while if you look at each weapon in a vacuum, then yeah, I guess they're the best they have ever been up to now. Well, some of them. And we'll get to that, but for context, I feel like it's important to point out that there's a major shift in gameplay priorities in the Ratchet and Clank games from now on and going forward. This has to do with the levels and how they're designed and stuff, and again we'll go over this later in much more detail, but for now the important part is that at this point the games are focusing much more on being a third-person shooter action game than a platformer action hybrid. This does of course influence the weapons heavily, and we'll see a few prime examples of that with the ones that return from the previous games. Yet, there are also some weird additions in here. Anyways, the first 2 weapons you're given for free. The first one is the Shock Blaster, a close to medium range shotgun type weapon. This one is actually pretty great, to begin with. It's really fun and satisfying to use, and it also highlights the new weapon upgrade mechanic pretty well. Instead of upgrading your weapons with new features using hidden collectibles, they are now being upgraded as they level up. So instead of just increasing in power, you also get new features as you use them, which is a much better way to have the player feel like the upgrades are actually affecting the weapon itself, and not just its output. This is also reflected in the weapons upgrade screen, where if you pay attention you can see stuff like scopes and such getting added during the upgrading. That's not to say that the upgrades didn't matter in going commando, your weapons there changed shape and also sometimes changed how they worked even, but there were only really one upgrade tier, not counting the New Game Plus stuff. In Ouya, every weapon can reach level 5 during the first playthrough and then go up to 8 in the second and onwards. The addition of adding one extra feature along with more firepower like lock-on, a shock mod, a higher ammo capacity or other additional effects for each level makes each upgrade feel more significant compared to if they still had that dumb titanium bolt upgrade system from the previous game. The part that's kind of annoying is that it's not always clear what you get from each level. You kinda need to pay close attention or visit the weapons page in the start menu for each level up if you want to know more. But at the end of the day, it's a pretty good addition nonetheless. In the case of the Shock Blaster, at level 2 you get the ability to charge up your shots. You just need to shoot once first for some reason. At level 3 you get the lock-on mod, which why the hell would you even want to use that for a shotgun? The entire selling point for this thing is that you don't really have to aim. At level 4 you get a shock mod, and at level 5 it upgrades to the shock cannon, which shoots a really powerful death beam, for the lack of a better word, which decimates everything. You might think this sounds awesome, and on paper, it really is. Then what's with the "to begin with" at the start of the segment? Well, in terms of power, the Shock Blaster falls off frighteningly fast and hard. Even the Plasma Whip, which is available in the very next level, I might add, scales better than this. It still has somewhat of a fighting chance in terms of power if you use the charge shots, but here's the problem with that. It slows down the pace of the gameplay way too much. The reason it feels so good to use the Shock Blaster is that it can rapid fire shotgun blasts into multiple enemies at once, and that feeling somewhat diminishes after you have to charge it for a couple of seconds before letting loose. Also, not to mention, a little bit later, you'll have to use multiple charge shots to take down enemies, and at that point, it's just not only not worth it to charge the weapon, since spamming 5 shots are much more time efficient than charging up twice, but it also kills most of the joy that's felt while using it, since the enemies will start to not even flinch after getting shot. I think the best word to describe the Shock Blaster is underwhelming, especially when you take into consideration how powerful it not only looks, but also sounds. The sad part is that you'll eventually only be using it as a quick kill for small enemies, but there's this nagging feeling that this was never how the weapon was meant to be utilized. There is of course the death beam that is unlocked at level 5, but that's merely a big fuck you to everyone who likes this weapon. Oh wow, it felt like I was about to have a flashback at one point there. It's powerful, yes, but it drains 10 whole units of ammunition. That's insane, and 100% not worth the effort. With an ammo capacity of 50 at V5, that gives you 5 whole shots before you're empty, and at that point you already have weapons that does essentially what the death beam does, only better. There's no way around it, it's garbage. And I will acknowledge the speedrun tech that lets you shred bosses with this, but like I said in my work stream, I will not credit the game for what is essentially an overlooked exploit. What's so sad about all of this is that the Shock Blaster is a pretty unique weapon. There's nothing in the game that feels quite like it. So when you're forced to switch it out 1/4 into the game, there will always be this shotgun-sized hole in your heart that doesn't get filled until you start New Game Plus and can buy the mega upgrade that lets it actually be useful again. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the second free weapon you get during the first level, the Nitro Launcher. I really like this weapon, and it seems like most others do too. This is a bomb launcher, essentially. You press the weapon and it shoots a bomb in an arc towards your target. It has a really good mix of firepower and utility that I love, and it probably has the best explosion effect in the entire game. It's just really satisfying to watch it explode to the point where it actually makes me stop and watch the show whenever I launch one of them. That's probably not a good thing, but what can you do? It's a slow upgrade though, requiring 5 times as much experience as the Shock Blaster would when going from V4 to V5. But then again, it's also twice as powerful as a level 5 Shock Blaster at level 1. So who the hell cares? It's almost a bit too powerful to be honest, although some of that is mitigated by the limited ammo capacity. Like even at V5 it only has 12 shots in it. This makes it so that you have to use the weapon somewhat sparingly when there aren't ammo crates around, and also the rate of fire is pretty bad, making you have to wait several seconds between each shot. Possibly because the PS2 simply couldn't handle more than one of these at a time, but holy hell dude, you'll have some great use for this one for a good while. At level 2 it gets an acid mod, but like, how would you even tell? It takes down pretty much anything except bosses in one shot at this point anyways. At V3 it gets a lock-on feature, but again, this is a weapon that covers a large area, so it's not really that useful. At V4 it gets an increased blast radius, and at V5 it upgrades to the Nitro Eruptor. And yeah, even the name exudes power. Going from V4 to V5 doubles the firepower, increases the blast radius even more, and adds some shrapnel or some shit to the blast, which is, by the way, even cooler looking now. But like, who the hell cares about some shrapnel? It blasts every enemy to smithereens at this point, and it'll stay like that until really late in the game, where it's essentially only surpassed by the Annihilator if you can actually afford it, and even then it doesn't catch up in raw power until level 3, and it also never gets the same amount of blast radius either. Or the Bouncer, which is one of the last weapons you'll have access to. This might actually be one of my favorite weapons in the entire game, looking back. It's so funny how they give you one of the worst weapons and one of the best ones for free, almost simultaneously at the start of the game. From this point on though, they'll cost you. The first of which is the Plasma it's the N60 Storm, actually. Both of these weapons become available at the same time during your first visit to Florana. The age of drip feeding you weapons to make you at least try them out before you're presented with another one is over, I guess. But then again, it's not like you'll be able to afford the N60 Storm until after you've completed the level without having bought the Plasma Whip. But I won't delve further into that for now. The N60 is probably the closest you'll get to your average video game gun in Rack 3. You hold the fire button and it shoots bullets until it's empty. It's basically the Ratchet and Clank version of the automatic rifle, just without any of the bells and whistles that are usually included to make the weapons feel like something that belongs in a futuristic video game. This changes at least a little bit as the weapon levels up though, making the bullets ricochet off of walls like the Golden Blaster from Rack 1. Then at level 3 it gets a lock-on mod, which is actually useful for this kind of weapon, finally. At level 4 it gets the shock mod, and at level 5 it upgrades to the N90 Hurricane, which ups the rate of fire, and that's pretty much it. For the most part, these upgrades serves to make the N60 more adaptable, and it really is suitable in a lot of different situations. Early on, you can use it just as well against small enemies despite being outclassed by the weapons you already have, and the bigger ones. Its strength lies in not only its power, but also its ammo capacity, yet it suffers from the same problem as the shock cannon. It's a relatively unique weapon in that there's not really anything that can take its place gameplay-wise, and it starts to fall off damage-wise around mid-game. Its saving grace is that it's still somewhat effective against large groups of small enemies thanks to its upgrades, and its power, being 250 points more than the shock cannon, is the final nail in the coffin for the shotgun. Speaking of unique weapons, the Plasma Whip. It always feels like I'm in the minority of people who actually likes the melee weapons in these games. I really like the Walloper from the first game. It's a goddamn punching glove, for Christ's sake, how could you not? The Plasma Whip, however, is, well, a whip. Despite this glaring characteristic, it actually acts more like your wrench. There's not really any whipping being done at all, to be honest. You just swing it around, and honestly, when compared to a certain whip weapon in one of the later games, I think this was the right call. I truly do like using the wrench in these games, but there's no incentive to use it for anything except breaking boxes and environmental stuff, since when you kill enemies with it, you miss out on experience for any weapon you could have used instead. It seems like the Plasma Whip was created to somewhat fix this, giving the player a close combat melee weapon that could also be upgraded with continuous use. And it works. For a little while, at least, because just like most of the other early game weapons, it gets relegated to taking care of small enemies, and pretty quickly at that. I mentioned that it scales better than the Shock Blaster, but that's only barely true, and it doesn't get any useful mods like the Shock mod or anything either. It does make up for that though by having a frankly insane radius to it. You can basically reach all the way around Ratchet with just one attack, which makes it especially good at taking out enemies that try to swarm you from all sides. In addition, it gets new modifiers to its attacks at level 4 and 5, where it'll produce a shockwave that travels along the ground when you use the jump attack at V4, and trails that shoot out from your normal attacks at V5 when it upgrades to the Quantum Whip. To be fair, this weapon was never meant to contend with the big ones, right? It was always meant to be a creep destroyer, but it can also take out the mid-sized ones pretty easily if you play your cards right. Since this is basically the wrench with an ungodly reach, it's pretty easy to dodge any enemy that can't shoot, and even the ones who can but have a short range, since you can also throw the whip. I will readily admit that it does have its fair share of problems, but above all, I think that this weapon just looks cool, and it's really fun to use. It's just that this being a melee weapon presents a few new problems that aren't as noticeable with the ranged ones. The worst of which is the problem with enemies no longer getting staggered when they're dealt more than a certain amount of damage. This makes it incredibly easy to get hit since you're essentially at point blank. This also happens if you attack too fast, but I think that's more of a bug where the game doesn't always register a consecutive attack with a whip as hitting for some reason. And this problem is especially annoying in challenge mode, where your bolt multiplier disappears after you're hit only once. This weapon also burns through ammunition. It's not the fastest firing thing ever, but it does attack relatively fast. I'd say that it's a bit faster than the wrench is, at least that's what it feels like, and its ammo capacity is only at 25 at V1, doubled to 50 at V5. And when almost every medium-sized enemy takes at least 2 to 3 hits to kill, then the ammunition disappears quickly. And suddenly standing in the middle of a group without any ammo on your equipped weapon rarely works out in your favor. You could, of course, just switch weapons, but in the time it takes you to realize that you're empty, you've already been damaged. Also, I mentioned that the plasma whip was meant to kinda replace the wrench, right? Well, the funny thing about that is that in Ouya, the wrench power actually scales with your maximum nanotech. And I think this is a pretty good idea, but as a result, it kinda undermines the whip since the wrench actually scales into, or at least very near it, in power after a little while. It never fully surpasses it, the whip has far too many extra features for that, but in terms of power, it's always inching along just behind. So then the question becomes more of a, should I go into the menu and switch to the whip in order to take down these critters, or just use my wrench and be finished with it? Because the wrench will almost always be strong enough to take them out in one hit anyways, it's almost hard to justify taking the time to bring out a fully upgraded whip that also won't gain any benefits for taking down those enemies. And then we're moving on from a weapon that's hard to justify using to one that is impossible to justify using, the Infector. This weapon is easily among the top 5 worst weapons in any of the Ratchet and Clank games. I have no idea what they were thinking when they decided to include this. To put things into perspective, with Rack 3, Insomniac decided to fully embrace the action side of things, making it a goal of theirs to have the player continuously being engaged in fights as they played through the levels. The Infector drives the gameplay in the exact opposite direction of that goal. You shoot out a blob of goo that will slowly jump towards the nearest enemy and infect them, making them friendly towards you and hostile towards your enemies. It's basically a mind control device, so it looks like that engineer from the first game actually got some use out of that tech after all. The problem is that when infected, enemies often just kinda stand around for a little while before they start doing anything. And it's not like you can combine it with other weapons since you'll just end up stealing EXP from the Infector that way. So if you want to actually level the weapon, you'll have to stand around and wait for the infected dude to kill the other enemies. This works some of the time, but remember that their AI isn't exactly the smartest, so they have a lot of trouble hitting enemies moving around them, for example, since most of what they do is determine where something is and shoot towards that place without leading their shots or anything. This makes it fit extremely badly into the gameplay. It's almost funny in a way. You also can't use the Infector in areas with water, like in the sewers on Aquatos, unless you hit the enemies directly with the shot, since if it lands in the water, the shot instantly disappears. It's not even heavily situational like with some other weapons, it's just plain bad to the point where it almost rivals the Clank Sapper from Going Commando. Okay, maybe that was a bit harsh. It does actually reliably deal a tiny bit of damage while it's in effect, after all. But it's hard to tell just how much, and it's often either too little, where the enemy will be left standing after taking out a bunch of others, after which the effect will dissipate and it'll start attacking you again, which is hard to notice since the aura around them isn't very distinct, and the effect ending early also sometimes happens when there are still enemies nearby, and that's not supposed to happen, by the way. Or it'll deal too much damage and instantly destroy the enemy, like what happens when you go to try it out in the VR arena in the Starship Phoenix. The dummies will literally die before the effect has any chance to trigger, so that's neat. I guess Gadgetron was aware of how much this weapon sucked and did that on purpose. Speaking of weapons that suck, the Rhino 3. Now, of course it's gonna be the suck cannon. Who do you take me for? I have mixed feelings on this one. On one hand, it only costs 8,000 bolts. On the other, why would you pay for the suck cannon? On one hand, it's nice to have if you run out of ammunition on your other weapons. On the other, that never happens. On one hand, it's highly effective at taking out small enemies. On the other, so are a bunch of the other weapons. After thinking about it for a while, I do think I end up further towards the positive side than the negative. I mean, it's a good enough weapon, it's always fun watching these small Theronoids getting sucked in and fired back out, and for a little while it's actually quite powerful. But after you've bought the Annihilator and onwards, it falls off hard, and coupled with having to essentially charge it every time you want to use it, it's just not a weapon that I usually bring out unless I need to upgrade it. Maybe it would have seen a bit more use for me if you could pause and resume the sucking part, since the way it works now is that you'll need to hold the fire button down until it's full, since it'll automatically switch to expunging its contents after you let go, which means that if you want to suck up some more ammo when there's suddenly a slew of new small enemies coming at you, you'll have to empty the chamber first. Maybe it would be as simple as adding a feature where it would whittle down the medium-sized enemies until you actually suck them in too. Kinda like what the Rift Inducer does. But the only thing that really happens when the Suck Cannon levels up is that it gets an increase in power, and at V5, when it turns into the Vortex Cannon, gets an increased rate of fire. So alas, the way the Suck Cannon works right now, there are just too many other better options in my opinion. The Spitting Hydra, however, is sadly not one of them. It has the potential to be a really cool weapon, but it is severely outclassed in both power and utility almost immediately. For one, you most likely already have a somewhat upgraded nitro launcher at this point, so taking out multiple strong enemies at once is already covered by that one. The only advantages the Spitting Hydra has over the nitro launcher is that it has a longer range and that it can lock onto the enemies, basically ensuring that you won't miss, for the most part. But it can only lock on to up to 7 of them, starting at 3 and gaining 1 additional lock-on per level. Still though, a lock-on doesn't always guarantee a hit. Its power is also very underwhelming, even compared to your older weapons. This one also gets irrelevant the moment you buy the Annihilator, to be honest. It also has somewhat of the same problem as the Infector, in that it slows down the pace of the game a bit. Not as much as the Infector though, maybe more like the Suck Cannon or the Blitz Cannon I guess, since you have to charge it, and the lock-on isn't always very reliable, which doesn't help when you're in the middle of an intense shootout and need to get rid of the enemies quickly to get some breathing room. The Hydra is also trash at taking down anything but groups of enemies, since you can only lock on to a single enemy once, making its use against bosses or single larger enemies negligible. Oh boy. I wasn't kind to the Glove of Doom in the original game, and I'm not going to be kind here either. It's ironic that the theoretically most powerful weapon in the game, with a maximum power of 12,000, which is more than the fucking Rhino, is also one of the worst weapons in the game. I was pretty vocal about not liking these guys previously, and to be fair, they are handled much better here, but it's just not enough. At level 1 they start out just as they did in Rack 1, basically running up to the enemies and exploding in their faces. The problem here was that they couldn't cross gaps or climb up platforms, so they were stuck wherever you threw them out. The V2 and V3 versions somewhat alleviates this problem by giving them back-mounted laser cannons so that they can shoot enemies from a distance until they run out of ammo. Still, the brunt of the damage comes from the explosion, so if they can't reach them, they are still hugely ineffective weapons. I think maybe they can jump a bit at this point, but I'm not too sure that feature becomes available earlier than level 4. At V4 and 5, however, they turn into Going Commando Synthenoids, where they'll hover beside you and shoot as you run along before they fly over and explode. This fully solves the navigational issues, but then there's all the other things that are wrong with this weapon. To begin with, I mentioned that most of the damage comes from the final explosion. At V4 and onwards, that's fine, but as a passive weapon, you'll be firing a different weapon along with it, so there's a high chance that the agents won't even get a shot at exploding, and honestly, their normal shots are weak as fuck. Thankfully, they don't need to actually deal the killing blow to the enemies to get experience in this game, so it's enough to just let them out once in a while, but until V5, you'll have to go out of your way to efficiently upgrade them, especially from V3 and onwards, since those levels require an insane amount of experience compared to the previous ones. This makes the lesser versions of the Agents of Doom highly situational, where you'll need to use them behind cover or in big open fields without any platforming or gaps in the level. And that hurts the pacing of the game, though maybe not as much as the Infector does, but it's still kinda bad. Then there's the issue of having to constantly reapply them. They don't last very long, and summoning new ones means pausing the action, selecting the Glove of Doom, and watch Ratchet throw out an egg. During normal encounters, you can just reapply them after you've finished off the enemies, but during boss encounters, you're honestly just better off shooting them with your weapons instead of taking the time to switch back and forth. You can also only have 2 squads of 4 agents active at a time, refilling the missing members if you throw out another egg before they've all disappeared. This also means that you'll be wasting your ammo to fill up the squad if only 3 of them are missing, meaning if you want to use the Glove of Doom as a main weapon, but then again, why would you? You'll need to wait until there are at least 4 of them missing if you want to make effective use of your ammo. And you want to do that because the max capacity is at only 8 during the first run through and then 12 during challenge mode. The problem then is that even though their power level is high, it only applies to what amounts as 1 ammunition, which means 4 agents. So if you're lacking 3 of them, that makes the remaining one's normal shots even more lackluster. And then they're also pitifully fragile. Even the smallest shockwave will decimate the ones that are running around on the ground, making them even more of a situational weapon since you can't use them effectively against certain enemies or bosses. I really don't like passive weapons such as these. I don't think they add anything of value to the gameplay, and frankly, I find them boring as hell to use. They try to do something about this by upping the spectacle they make each level, but it just doesn't work for me. At the end of the day, it's another one of those weapons that I buy, upgrade, and promptly shove to the back of my mind. This and the Infector belongs in a category of niche weapons, created from someone completely misunderstanding the core aspect of this game, and it doesn't stop with the Glove of Doom. The Flux Rifle is another one of those weapons. Again, the same issue applies here. It's not really suited to the gameplay style that the game is trying to create. This is more of a strategic weapon and is supposed to be used over long distances, and herein lies the problem. There are almost no instances where this weapon can be used as intended. Sure, there are like 2 of those big battleground levels, but even then the enemies doesn't show up until you're a set distance away from them. So having a weapon that can zoom in even farther than that limit doesn't really make sense now, does it? Most of the other levels, the arena ones in particular, are all mostly closed off corridors or areas where you don't really gain much of a tactical advantage from attacking from afar, since there's nothing for you to attack in the first place. Case in point, Aquatos, which is also ironically the level where the Flux Rifle is made available. Yeah, that's kind of a kick to the balls, isn't it? So yet again, you have another weapon that you've got to go out of your way to level up, and which break the pace of the game as a result. It's an easy to use weapon when you have the opportunity to stand still and aim properly, but when you have to use it in the middle of a firefight against a bunch of enemies, it feels like literally attempting a 360 no-scope, because not only does it not have a lock-on feature, it doesn't even have a reticle like most of the other weapons have some form of. So you just end up jumping around like an idiot while shooting into the skybox, and you can only miss so much since you have a maximum ammo capacity of 15 at V5. The only upgrades it gets that aren't purely power related makes its shots explode at V4 and pass through enemies at V5, but that only really helps when you're attacking groups of smaller enemies, or maybe once or twice throughout the entire game where you can actually line up some of them. And when you do have this opportunity to shoot down some enemies from a distance that haven't noticed you, a lot of the time when you're in a regular level, they'll be close enough to start shooting and you can't really dodge or move at all while in first person mode. The Hollow Shield glove attempts to fix this problem, but actually just introduces a bunch of its own. Again, the same song and dance, a tactical weapon that's just unsuited to the game it's in. Honestly, its only use is as a portable cover for the Flux Rifle, and that's pretty much it. It's not even good cover, since enemies can just plain walk through them since they have no physical characteristics except for being able to block shots. This means that it has about no effect on physical attackers. It also does not have any damaging capabilities at V1. Yeah, none. It deals exactly 0 damage to enemies, and that makes it a bitch to upgrade to level 2, which is done by having enemies shoot at it, where it can actually deal a little bit of damage by draining HP from enemies and transferring it to Ratchet. Don't get your hopes up though, it still sucks combat-wise. It's not until V5 that it actually does some useful damage, but most of the time you might as well just strafe around attacks instead of taking the effort to bring out the shield and stand behind it, since simply dodging and shooting the enemies the normal way is much faster. You also have no idea when the shields will disappear either, though this might be a PS3 HD collection thing, like with how the shields are actually supposed to be translucent so that you can properly aim through them. The longevity of the shields are also a problem that gets worse the further into the game you get, because if you start trying to use them during the final levels, which is where it'll be easiest to upgrade them, they won't last long at all. Like, you'll throw one out, and before you're able to switch to a weapon, it'll be gone. They'll upgrade super fast if they actually get some damage in, but they can't really be used in a tactical way until they've caught up, and even then they're not useful for long since they never really last for any significant time, regardless of which level you're at. You can sorta bypass this by stacking the shields, but just like with the Flux Rifle, the ammo count isn't really there to compensate for how fast they disappear. If you've been following along, you might have noticed that I skipped a weapon. Well, I thought it'd be best to get all the boring ones out of the way before talking about this one, because, well, there's nothing boring about a rocket launcher. The Annihilator is, if nothing else, true to its name. The moment you have access to it, it's by far the strongest weapon in your arsenal. The reason I phrase it like that though is because its listing price is at a whopping 150,000 bolts. For reference, the Holo Shield Glove, which is made available at the same time, sits at 30k. The Flux Rifle, which is the previously available big weapon, sits at half its price, 75k. And the next available weapon, the Disc Blade Gun, only costs 175k, a 25k increase. This weapon is a game changer. It has the power of the Nitro Launcher, the rate of fire of the N60 Storm, it has almost the range of, and it has a greater ammo capacity than the Flux Rifle, which means that it basically almost instantly makes your entire arsenal up to this point irrelevant. And the best part? It only gets better as it levels up. At V2, it releases small bouncing bomblets that start homing in on enemies at V3. Hey, that's just like the bouncer. Kinda weird since we'll be getting that weapon later though. At V4, it gets a lock-on mod, which is okay, it's nice to have I guess, but at V5, when it upgrades to the Decimator, it releases small homing rockets after every shot instead of the bomblets. Which is great, since we'll be getting the bouncer later. And combined with the rate of fire, this is just mwah. Other than that though, there's not really much that can be said about the Annihilator. It's a pretty basic rocket launcher type weapon, all things considered. It's slow to upgrade, but that's to be expected considering the sheer destructive force of the weapon. There's also a case to be made about its price, especially since it's made available in the very next level after a new armor upgrade is purchasable, which is also very costly, making you have to choose between survival and fun, essentially. I bought the armor, so when the Annihilator was made available for purchase, I didn't even have 15k on me, but we'll talk more about that later. Fine, it can't be all rainbows and sunshine. There is one thing, and while it's not really a fault of the weapon itself, it is brought on by it. Since the entire arsenal so far is outclassed by this one weapon from now on, they have to keep one-upping the Annihilator for every new inclusion. All this does is dig the hole deeper and deeper until almost none of the weapons that comes before the rocket launcher can make much of a dent in the enemies, since they also need to get stronger and stronger so as not to go down in one hit from the progressively stronger and stronger weapons. You see where I'm going with this? For example, while the Disc Blade Gun, which is made available only 2 levels later, start out at the same power as the Annihilator, it scales drastically better than it. At V3, the power level of the Annihilator is at 800, while the Disc Blade is at a whopping 1400, almost the double. Granted, this power level is only theoretic in a sense. At V2, the blades can ricochet off of walls, so that if you miss an enemy, there's still a chance that the attack might hit. At V3, however, the discs get the ability to ricochet off of enemies, making each shot theoretically able to hit multiple foes. Theoretically. The sad truth is that, even with the increased homing capabilities of V4, this feature basically does not work. It might work sometimes, if you're lucky, but most of the time the blades will end up shooting into the horizon after hitting a single enemy or getting stuck in the ceiling of the arena. So that means that even with its power level reaching a staggering 3600 at V5, the only reason why it's so high is because it can split into a bunch of different blades at that point. But it doesn't matter since they're not used to their full potential, since the homing feature rarely works. That's not to say that the first shot doesn't deal any damage, they're still seemingly doing the brunt of it, but the rest of the potential is almost immediately lost. I wasn't going to bring this up before I started talking about the returning weapons from 2, but I think this deserves some special acknowledgement. This is the exact same problem the chopper had back then.
Chopper is a weapon I have very mixed feelings about. On one hand, it's a freaking throwing star with homing capabilities, but on the other, it stops your movements whenever you try to use it while on the ground, making it almost a necessity to jump around to make use of it properly. This in turn makes it harder for the reticule to align, and you need the reticule to be fixed on an enemy for the homing to work as intended. Because if you're not properly aligned, it makes the star fly out into nothingness or hit a wall behind the enemy line, making it do fuck all. There's also a matter of firepower. In my experience, the chopper is pretty strong to begin with, but then slowly becomes almost worthless towards the end, and that's even taking into account the upgraded version, the multi-star, that spawns 2 blades when the first one hits an enemy. If it had better homing capabilities, I'd probably use it more, but as it is now, it's just not worth the effort when other weapons does its job better in more fun ways.
And no, this is not a new weapon in any regard. It's the same shit with a different name. What's so weird is how they pretty much fixed all the problems I had with the other returning weapons from 2, but then completely fucked up this one. Or rather, they did absolutely nothing to fix its one glaring flaw. Maybe it was an engine thing that they couldn't get working? Who knows, but either way, I'm always left with that burning feeling that this weapon should never have been included in this state. It's almost more annoying when it works, but not quite as intended, than when it just straight up doesn't, right? It's a shame too, because it had the potential of being a really cool weapon. Not as cool as the Rift Inducer though. This was actually a weapon originally created for going commando, but since it ended up being too overpowered and they didn't have time to balance it, it was cut. It's still really overpowered though. The Rift Inducer basically shreds every enemy up to a certain size, and considering how this weapon works, I guess that was the only real way to balance it without making it feel underwhelming. You essentially shoot out a black hole that sucks enemies into it. It depletes the enemies' health and then sucks them in when it kills them, essentially. I'm not completely clear on how exactly this mechanic works, however, because it seems kinda random at times. In that sense, it's more akin to the Quaco Ray, except you can't really tell at a glance how close the enemies are to dying. I guess this is where the lock-on mod comes into play, but since this is a multi-target weapon, it's mostly useless. This also means that its synergy with other weapons aren't that good. On the other hand, you don't really need any other weapons than this one as long as there aren't any big enemies around, because the small enemies, like the one-eyed Theronoids, are just instantly sucked in almost the instant they approach the hole, and the medium ones too after a little more time, maybe. The way they balanced the Rift Inducer was that it does nothing against the bigger enemies, at all. This makes the weapon entirely ineffective against big enemies and also bosses. Even when upgraded to the Rift Ripper, which shocks nearby foes, it still has no effect on them. I understand the issue of bosses, it's not like you can just insta-kill them, right? Still, the fully upgraded version could have at least dealt some damage, especially considering that at V2 you can combine the holes by placing them next to each other, which really only increases the damage they deal. But for the most part, that's not necessary at all, and there's not even that much of a notable difference, except for them being able to clear enemies a little bit faster for each combined hole. Honestly, you're better off just placing them at different spots in the room to cover a wider area, especially since it's a very powerful weapon. As long as you're up against enemies it can actually damage, this thing outclasses almost every other weapon. It doesn't have a long reach compared to other weapons, in fact I'd consider it a medium range weapon at best, which can make it tricky to use against enemies that have ranged attacks. It's mostly a tactical weapon by nature, yet compared to the other tactical weapons, this one actually fits the gameplay. It takes down enemies fast, it can be positioned to defeat enemies wherever, and you can place out multiple instances of the black hole at once, which makes you able to run and gun. Considering the longevity of the holes, the ammo capacity is pretty good as well. Which is what makes the Quaco Ray pretty unique. Or, well, the lack of ammo, that is. Surprisingly, this is another weapon that have been properly integrated into the new gameplay style. Not only does the gun transform most enemies fast, but they also transform into ducks that can attack foes. At V2, the ducks will lay explosive eggs that are basically just retextured bouncer bomblets that will seek out foes at V3. And then at V4, the ducks themselves will go on the offensive, culminating in the giant flaming duck created by the V5 version, the Quaco Blitzer. In contrast to the Sheepinator, this one is actually useful almost to begin with, and it only gets better to the point where you don't really need a different weapon, since you'll either sap enemies into ducks, or the ducks will take care of the enemies for you. Thanks to its power being relatively high, it can also surprisingly be a very effective run and gun weapon despite the range of the beam being so much shallow. It's super effective in tight corridors with a lot of small enemies like the sewers and aquados, where not only is it easy to hit the enemies with the beam, but the eggs from the ducks are also more focused. The only real downside with the Quaco Ray is that it's not effective on bosses, though in contrast to the Rift Inducer, it does work on the larger enemies, it just takes a bit more time to turn them. I think the most impressive part of this weapon for me is how they took a concept that I didn't really care about and made it actually fun to use compared to the previous iterations. Which is something they also did successfully with the returning weapons from Going Commando, in most cases. To start us off, the Mini-Turret Glove. My main problem with this weapon last time was that the upgraded version replaced the normal shots with rockets that not only had a slower rate of fire, but was also slower in general. The Mega Turret Glove felt more like a downgrade because of it, but in Ouya, there are some key upgrades that makes them much better. A small issue with the turrets were that they could be slow to target enemies and that they didn't do too well against enemies moving perpendicular from them. The V3 upgrade gives the shots a slow effect in the form of ice explosive that, when combined with the faster lock-on speed of V4, almost completely eliminates this issue. It still upgrades into a rocket launcher at V5, but this version feels speedier and more accurate. But more importantly, they teleport along with you whenever they're out of reach. These upgrades kinda completes the weapon and increases its utility, when they work. Yeah, the upgrades makes the weapon fit better into the playstyle the game is aiming for, but the teleporting especially seems kinda buggy and have a tendency to just not work. And while the slow effect is nice, it's really only effective at enemies that move around, which are usually the weak ones that get taken out in one shot. Also, while the rockets do move faster this time around, they still move slower than the normal laser shots, which means that while the rocket still applies the slow effect, it's applied far later than with the normal version. There's also this weird issue where the turrets won't target enemies that aren't in view of the player, making it hard to trust the turrets to watch your back in the middle of a firefight. Also, while the turrets will move with you as you progress, they're kinda slow to react and will only start to follow you when they're out of targets. The problem is that they treat normal boxes as targets as well and will fire at them if there aren't any enemies around, and as such won't teleport until they've destroyed all the boxes also. Because of this, the only place the turrets truly shine is yet again in the arena, where the baddies are easily kept within frame and where all the enemies are moving towards you, which makes the slow actually matter, and you never run out of targets in close proximity. Close proximity is kinda the key word for the Megacorp weapons, to be honest, and the trend continues with the Lava Gun. Oh my god. The best weapon from Going Commando returns, and they have truly learned their lesson with this one. The Lava Gun no longer upgrades to the Meteor Gun, a weapon that is as far removed from its original concept that you can get. Instead, it upgrades to the Liquid Nitrogen Gun, which is everything the Lava Gun is, only better. It's essentially the same weapon from Going Commando, but this time it's the same all the way through. The only notable change is that the nitrogen gun adds a special freezing effect to small and medium enemies when it kills them, and if they were to survive, they get slowed down, giving the weapon at least a little bit of utility, which pairs well with its reach and how it's used. It uses up a lot of ammunition pretty fast, but except for that, I don't know what else to say really. It's just a really fun weapon, and proof that Insomniac actually learned at least a little bit from the last game in terms of weapon design. I wish they'd learned a bit more from the plasma coil though. This is the only long-range weapon of the bunch, and it's pretty much identical to its Going Commando counterpart. There's a limit to how much you can do when it already functions pretty well in both settings, but did they have to keep it so boring? I mean, the Plasma Storm is cool, with its arcing strands of electricity shooting out and hitting every enemy in its path, but the V1 through V4 versions are really drab in comparison. And that's the thing, right? Since there were just one upgrade tier between the Coil and the Storm in Going Commando, it didn't really matter that much. But here, there's 4, and the base weapon just isn't that interesting looking. The rate of fire sucks, the design sucks, the sounds sucks, it just all around sucks. The only good thing about it is the damage it does, but that's being undersold by its lame appearance. Even when it hits an enemy and its plasma arcs hit the one besides it, it just goes blah. That's it. It's a good weapon, it's just really boring to use until V5 and upwards. Jumping from the most boring weapon to the bouncer. A fan favorite, and with good reason? It's a relatively simple weapon with a lot of spectacle and can be used in pretty much every situation. You press the button, it shoots out a big bomb that explodes into smaller bouncy bombs that also home in on enemies. There's literally nothing to not like. Or is there? Personally, I think it's kinda mid. At least I don't think as highly of it as a lot of people and the fanbase in general does. Insomniac even included the weapon as a pre-order bonus for Ratchet and Clank 2016, which was also the only way to unlock it. Also, fuck that game. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I think the problem with the bouncer is just how versatile it is, which I realize is a weird thing to say, but just stick with me for a bit. Since it can be used effectively anywhere, there's nothing stopping you from using it anywhere, and while its ammo capacity stays limited throughout all the upgrades, you get a lot out of a single shot. It's especially good at taking down enemies behind cover, but at this point you have other weapons that function even better than the bouncer, which means that the only thing the weapon really has going for it is its power and versatility. I'd argue that while it's not as visually dull as the plasma coil, it sure has the feeling of the plasma coil down pat. The bouncer only feels special for the first couple of times you use it, and afterwards, it's kinda boring. Yet unlike the plasma coil, it stays boring throughout all its upgrades. There's not really anything tactical about it, since even if you miss, the bouncing bombs will just home in on the enemies in most cases, and it's not as visually appealing as, say, the Nitro Eruptor. There's no skill or dodging involved like with the N60 or Spitting Hydra, even in large groups of enemies, since as long as you hit the enemy, they're either stunned long enough for you to get off another shot, or in most cases, dead. It's too powerful to the point where it removes everything that's supposed to be fun about the encounters. You can literally duck out from behind cover for half a second, shoot a bouncer shot, duck back behind cover, and watch as the weapon introduces you to the worst sound design of anything in the entire game. The bombs lack oomph. They literally sound like firecrackers when they explode, which does not at all indicate the power behind them, which are at multiple points supposed to be greater than the Annihilator's rockets. This disconnect in the audio-visual experience is a lot of the reason why I don't like using the bouncer that much. Also, its upgrade just makes it worse somehow, since it makes the bombs bigger. Yeah, I don't get the hype behind this one. In contrast, the shield charger, which is yet another not only boring weapon but also a passive one, is oddly enough one of my favorites. It's super simple too, you just equip it and there it is. To begin with, it doesn't do much except protect you from attacks and slightly damage enemies that touches it, but when it reaches V5, it turns into the Tesla barrier, which also zaps nearby enemies. Like the Holoshield glove, it can be a pain to upgrade, though thanks to the shared experience gain, it's not as bad as in Going Commando, where you had to make sure the shield actually killed the enemies. And also you don't need that much XP to level it up either. Speaking of the Holoshield glove, the shield charger is basically a much better version of it, since it's not limited to where you throw it out. In fact, one of my favorite things about the shield charger is how it instantly outclasses the holo shields. Like, the second you get this weapon, you have no incentive to ever use the holo shield ever again, and I find it maybe a bit too funny that they decided to include both of them, since the shield charger itself highlights how bad of an idea the holo shield glove was. The difference is obviously how well each of the weapons adapts to the gameplay. The barrier activates instantly and lets you run around as you like while providing great protection against both ranged and melee attackers. The stationary shields requires you to carefully plan and place your walls and forces you to hide behind them if you want them to be of any use. And most importantly, enemies can merely pass right through without any trouble. The only advantage the holoshields has over the barrier are the different additional effects like bullet deflection, pulse damage, and lifesteal, but ultimately none of that matters when it's as niche as this thing is. Even when we're talking niche uses, the shield charger comes out on top. There's one place in the game where the Tesla barrier specifically comes in very handy, and that is in the sewers of Planet Aquatos. When traveling through the pipes, there'll pop out amoeboids from everywhere, and especially in front of you. Equipping the Tesla barrier lets you fly forwards with the charge boots and completely disregard the amoeboids since they'll get sapped to Kingdom Come whenever they get near, which also means you won't crash into them and disrupt the charge boots. The Tesla barrier is also a great thing to have in challenge mode since you'll lose your bolt multiplier whenever you're hit. Sadly, you'll still lose the multiplier if an enemy manages to attack you and damage the shield, but the chance of that happening are much lower when any melee enemy that gets within range are zapped. It feels like your hitbox is a tiny bit larger with the shield equipped though, making some shots from ranged enemies hit you even though it doesn't feel like it would have, but that's pretty much its only weak spot. And that prompts us to move on to the weapon that doesn't have a weak spot. The Rhino? Rhino 3? Rhythrino? I have no idea, but what I do know though is that this thing fucking sucks. Yeah, the thing about the Rhino not having any weak spots was pure BS. This is surprisingly one of the worst and most disappointing weapons in the entire game. The entire point of the Rhino weapons are to have some sort of reward for the people that decided to go the little extra mile. The third one is not even available until after you've beat the game and cleared all your story progress by starting challenge mode. It's also worth a lot of bolts, making you have to save up for at least a little while, and doing that from the get-go also means having to pass on most of the additional weapon upgrades that are unlocked during challenge mode. The first Rhino was, frankly, insane. Not only in a weapon sense, but also in a coolness sense. It fired 9 homing rockets which could each lock on to a separate enemy. It's literally a, barely, handheld vehicle mounted MRL. The rockets also had an incredibly satisfying explosion sound when they hit, were extremely powerful to the point where you could take down the last boss in seconds, and to top that off, it had an ammo capacity of 50. This really made it feel like a truly dangerous weapon that you would need some special permission to buy, so getting it from some black market dealer fits pretty well. But that's the part about the first Rhino that they kinda botched a bit: the price. At 150,000 bolts, way more than you'll accumulate during your entire first playthrough, you'd probably have to play through the game twice or even thrice to be able to afford it. And at that point, there's not really much to do except for trying it out a bit and then call it quits. It's a really fun and cool weapon, but you have to work a bit too hard to get it. The Rhino 2 is almost as cool, though maybe a little bit underwhelming in the sound and feel department. It's essentially a Gatling rocket launcher, which sounds about as insane as it actually is, but the rockets lack a bit of oomph to them. It's still incredibly powerful though, but its shots aren't homing this time, which can make it difficult to deal with fast-moving enemies, yet the shots themselves are fast enough for it to not feel too bad. Still, it's not exactly something you'd expect from an all-powerful weapon, I suppose, but I welcome it. It makes you have to think at least a little bit while using it instead of just being a press button to win weapon. Besides, if you wanted that kind of experience in going commando, there's always the Zodiac, which is, funnily enough, the weapon that has the most in common with the Rhino 3. Or, well, at least its ultimate form, because it starts out okay. This weapon is mostly a combination of the two previous ones. It shoots out a bunch of rockets at once which can all target individual objects or enemies. 8 at first and then 16 at V4. These change slightly when going from V1 to V2, turning into energy blasts that disintegrate enemies. The problem here is that there's no real impact from the energy blasts. You can hardly even tell that they hit the enemies. If the Rhino 2 lacks oomph, then the Rhino 3 is completely devoid of it. The shots doesn't even home in on enemies, but unlike the Rhino 2, the shots are so slow that it doesn't take much for the enemies to avoid them. In short, the Rhino 3 doesn't feel like an ultimate weapon in the same vein as the 2 previous ones did, but that's just for V1 through 4. The real insult to the entire Rhino brand comes along at V5, when it upgrades to the Rhinocerator. I really thought that Insomniac had learned something about the weapons from going commando, but this completely shatters that illusion. The only reason they made changes to the lava gun was because of the massive backlash, it seems, because they're still not done fundamentally changing how weapons work. At V5, the Rhino 3 changes into the Zodiac 2. I'm not even kidding, it's horrible. The Zodiac itself is already bad enough, but at least it doesn't upgrade into what it is from a more functional weapon. Instead of shooting a bunch of individual blasts, it now shoots all the shots in a concentrated beam that flies up into the sky, combines into a sphere that explodes in a white flash, and disintegrates every enemy on screen. The problems with this are all very obvious. This is a more action-oriented shooter, so having to wait a few seconds for the weapon to actually go off doesn't play to the game's strengths. The Rhino can now no longer significantly damage bosses unless you stand almost literally right next to them so that the beam hits them on the way up. And if you're not able to reach them with the beam, then forget about it, because the damage the flash itself does to them is pitiful. This means that the number one thing that made the previous Rhino so fun, the ability to shred down bosses, is completely gone. You can't even rapid fire the weapon because it takes so long to go off, which means that in theory, you now have a lower damage output than even its least upgraded form. The screen clear also have no effect on enemies that you can't actually see, which means that you can fire off a shot and still get attacked from behind during the white flash and have no idea what damaged you. And talking about that white flash, it's super disrupting and kinda ruins the flow of the game, since you get slightly disoriented every time you use a weapon because you can't see a damn thing during it. I can't stress enough how detrimental this upgrade is, not only to the weapon itself, but also the gameplay. It actively makes the game worse whenever you use it, and that is not something you want for what is supposed to be the ultimate reward for sticking with something until the end. Weirdly enough, I think the Rhino 3 perfectly exemplifies the overall arsenal in Ouya. If you've played the previous two games, I bet you've already noticed, but as far as the weapons goes, there aren't really a lot of new concepts here, and the ones that aren't tried and true, with some exceptions, kinda sucks. Well, figuratively and literally, because the Rift Inducer is actually really cool, but even that weapon was meant to be included in Going Commando, they just didn't have time to balance it properly. The game might feature a staggering 20 different weapons which I honestly think have much better variation in their features and core concepts than the arsenal in Going Commando, but only 5 of them are actually new, and the ones that aren't feel more straight ripped out of the previous games without taking into consideration the gameplay of the game they're inserted into than anything else. They tried to fix some of the problems that plagued the weapons in Going Commando, but they failed to realize how fundamentally different the two games were going to be. They also still haven't given up on forcing players to change around which weapons they're using. Having this huge collection of different weapons that almost all do different things, and then taking away 50% of them halfway into the game by making them too weak to be used properly, is a horrible way to have the players vary in their weapon usage. It signals a lack of faith in the weapons when the devs needs to force you into using them. I really don't think having a favorite weapon and maining it through the game is that big of a problem. Like, I get wanting the players to experience all the weapons from a developer standpoint, right? But shouldn't the player having fun be your top priority? Where's the fun in having your preferred weapon rendered useless for no reason and having to use one you're not comfortable with? I do think they do a good job of presenting something similar in a lot of cases, but the point still stands. I think a better way to do it would be to just make fun weapons, present them to the player and let them decide if they wanted to try them out or not. 70% of the gameplay in Ratchet and Clank does revolve around the weapons after all, so I don't think it makes sense to have this rigid system that places a hard cutoff point for some of them, especially when you already have a system in place that could help incentivize players to change things around. I am of course talking about the upgrade system. There are very few things in games that provides as big of an endorphin rush as this screen does. And I think they knew that since they increased the maximum level from 4 to 8. This screen also serves to notify you that your weapon just got stronger and or got equipped with more features. It's just too bad that they don't straight up tell you how much more powerful it gets, or what the new future is. Unless it's the lock-on mod, of course, which prompts the help desk text to show up like every time.
This weapon upgrade features a lock-on mod. To lock onto enemies, press and hold L2 and R2. This weapon upgrade features a lock-on mod. This weapon upgrade features a lock-on mod. Features a lock-on mod. Lock-on mod. A lock-on mod.
Now, you'll have to go into the weapons menu and read the weapon tooltips and try to remember if it says anything new. Also, that power stat is basically useless for trying to determine the effectiveness of a weapon unless you compare it to a different weapon with a wildly higher power stat. I also don't think it takes into account the rate of fire either, so its purpose is rather to compare the damage between its own upgrades, but it only shows the current power of the weapon, so unless you've been writing it all down for some reason, it's just a silly old meaningless statistic. But anyways, like I was getting to, it's this upgrade system that's the obvious fix to not only making the players try out all the different weapons, I mean, look at me. I don't like half of them, yet I still use them so that I can level them up. But it's also a fix to the whole gradual decline in weapon power. They already have a set amount of experience you need for each level, and this amount differs from each weapon and the respective levels. So instead of letting the weapons level up as fast as they do currently, you just have them require more experience at higher levels, but also give them more power to help them stay relevant. Hell, they basically do this with the Nitro Launcher, and it works so well that the Nitro Launcher only becomes useless around the last level because of it. And it kind of works like this already, where the later enemies will give more experience to help your low levels catch up to the rest, and that's a step in the right direction. I just wish the weapons wouldn't reach V5 in the course of like 3 levels after you buy them. I mean, at this point, the challenge mode is a main part of the game, and if you play it normally, then weapons like the bouncer or Tesla coil won't reach V5 until well into your second playthrough anyways, so why not just embrace that fact? I'm not saying that you should have trouble upgrading the Shock Blaster, for example, so that it won't reach V5 until you're near the end of the game, but rather that it should start gaining traction at a normal rate percentage-wise when going from V4 to V5, first when you're about halfway into the game, or something. You know, instead of getting completely screwed over by the power level hierarchy. Instead, the weapons should be used based on their utility and how fun you personally find them to be, and not because you're forced to since you can't damage enemies with them. I mean, for fuck's sake, near the end of the game, the only weapons that even make a dent in the enemies are the bouncer and the Tesla coil, 2 of the last weapons you gain access to. Like, you know something is wrong when it takes 3 shots from a rocket launcher that releases more rockets from the missile when the original rocket explodes to take down a regular enemy. Oh, and not to mention that when you buy the Mega version of the shock cannon in challenge mode, its power increases by 1000. It literally goes from 100 to 1100 in power, and even worse, the Nitro Launcher gets a 3400 increase from 800 to 4200. The difference here is actually insane, and the weird part is that at V8, all the weapons are pretty well balanced to the point where even the Shock Blaster actually works against the late game enemies. The thing that's so annoying though is that it's not bad balancing. Well, it is, but it was a conscious decision. I don't think that was the case when they decided on how much to charge for the weapons, however. New to the third installment is that weapons are no longer drip-fed to the player one by one for each new level, at least not early on. Rather, they're made available in batches of 2 and 2, while spacing them out a bit more later as they get more expensive. To begin with, they usually pair one cheap weapon and one expensive one. They can't have had any idea how to price these though. Some weapons, like the disc blade gun and the annihilator, are so expensive that you'll go multiple levels from having access to them to actually having enough bolts to buy them. There are also armor upgrades to take into consideration when deciding what to use your money on, so a lot of the time you'll end up buying the weapons far later than they're made available. In some cases, it seems like they really want you to do all the arena challenges to be able to buy them, but sometimes that's still not enough. Even before I bought the armor that was made available right before the Annihilator goes on sale, I was still missing almost half of the total of bolts needed to buy it, and I had done every possible optional content available at that point, including the arena. There's even a system in place that increases the bolts you earn based on if you missed any boxes in the previous levels, and they moved away from gatekeeping your progress with monetary objectives, yet there's still a money issue. Or at least that's how they make it look, because in the case of the disc blade and the Annihilator, when you do get your hands on them like 4 levels after they're introduced in the shop, they're still OP as hell. This is also not having taken into consideration having to buy the Megacorp weapons since you get them for free with a Rack 2 save, or having to buy all the other weapons at full price since I got a 10% discount from having a Rack 1 save. So in total, I probably shouldn't have had enough to buy those weapons until even later, and I have no idea why they decided to make it that way. Like, look at this. This is my last playthrough, where I didn't buy a bunch of the weapons, and I could only barely afford the Tesla coil near the end. I even only ever bought the first armor upgrade. You won't gain anything special from not buying the cheap weapons to save up for the expensive ones. All you're doing is keeping yourself from having fun with all the other weapons you could have bought instead. Like, I get having these 1 or 2 big goals to aim towards, right? In this case though, it just hampers your ability to enjoy the game how you want to, and if you buy some of the weapons too late in the game, they're already useless, since they won't deal any significant damage even at max level. This is why I like the system in Rack 1 and to some extent the less extreme one in Rack 2, because if you played through the game normally, then chances are you'd go at most a couple of levels without being able to buy the next weapon, and even then that'd only happen during the last third of the games. And as for Rack 1 in particular, none of the weapons ever got too weak to use. They became a bit more niche, yeah, but you can still use them effectively to take down enemies. It's a shame that a game that is all about having fun while using a bunch of different weapons should have this many problems related to them. But unlike the previous game, the problems aren't related to weapons having little variation in their core concepts. This time it's the creativity and the failure to properly incorporate the weapons into the gameplay that presents the biggest issues. Some of that can be attributed to the level design of course, but that's the question of the chicken and the egg, isn't it? So to help us paint a larger picture here, let's first talk about the multiplayer. You'll see why. I never had much experience with the multiplayer. We didn't have the network adapter that was required to play online, and we also had no idea how to set it up, so. I have some vague memories of running around in one of the levels alone, but that's pretty much it. Honestly, I might have dreamt that part up. Anyways, development of the core game and the multiplayer started around the same time. The multiplayer team was at that time, pretty small to say the least. The time frame is pretty obvious when we look at all the different textures for boxes, and especially the reused weapons they borrowed from earlier games. There's only one new weapon concept here, maybe because of the time constraints, or maybe because they struggled to come up with something that suited the game mode, and it's that one I find to be the most interesting addition, the Hollow Shield Glove. Why? Well, because boy does that answer a lot of questions about its inclusion in the single player. There's also the Mind Glove, but that's just an interesting addition because they never included it in the main game. As for the rest, they're all there, which means that 8 of the 20 weapons probably got included because they were reused from the multiplayer mode, and considering how you'd use a more tactical approach when playing against other humans, yeah, I can see a use for the Flux Rifle and the Hollow Shield Glove in game modes like Capture the Flag. It's just a shame that they had to include them in the single player as well. However, the weapons weren't the only thing that were reused, although it's at this point where the consensus of what came first gets a bit blurred. No one can seem to remember or agree if the Battleground maps was ported over from the multiplayer to the single player or vice versa. Personally, I think that they mostly made the Battlegrounds for single player first, but some of them are obviously made exclusively for multiplayer. These being the Hopping Gorge, Backsea Isles, Blackwater Docks, and Command Center, which are stages that doesn't feature in the single player. I do, however, think that maybe the Aquatos Sewers and Blackwater City stages were also a part of this batch to begin with, but that's really only based on the complexity of the stages themselves. The multiplayer exclusive stages doesn't have as much going on as the single player ones, and considering the size of the team that was responsible for the multiplayer, which to begin with was literally just a handful of people, that would make sense. So yeah, excluding the weapons, I don't think the multiplayer had as much of an impact on the single player as it might seem at first, especially considering how the two modes were developed in parallel. Yet there are some obvious carryovers, though if that's just because of Insomniac's focus on the new style of gameplay or not is impossible to know for sure without asking them directly. I swear, developers should be required to carefully record every step of the game-making process for the explicit reason of making it easier to write about their games 18 years after their release. No one's thinking of the YouTubers, man. Anyways, as I've mentioned probably multiple times already, Ouya fully makes the transition to a third-person shooter first and a puzzle platformer second, and this change is heavily mirrored in the level design. Levels have a bunch more enemy encounters than in previous games, a decision made because of Insomniac's improved focus on never having the player experience a dull moment during gameplay. This means that there is no longer a conscious effort to separate the puzzle parts and the combat parts, rather it's the opposite. The levels are now mostly linear and without any alternate routes. The original game usually had a puzzle path that had little to no enemies in it, making you able to focus on the platforming and the puzzle solving aspect of the gadgets. Going Commando started experimenting with the formula by introducing enemies during these paths also, but nothing too much, and they were also mostly separate from the main combat routes. Up Your Arsenal merely combines them all into the main path, the only path. This has the effect of making levels feel much less like planets or worlds that can be explored, which used to be a part of the core of the Ratchet and Clank games, and taking away that part makes it feel like you're stripping away a piece of the soul of the series. It also makes the levels themselves feel less varied, but to fully explore this idea, let's start from the top. The first level in the game takes place on Veldin, and the difference in what they're trying to achieve in comparison with the two previous games with not just the gameplay, but also the story and the music is immediately obvious. But let's focus on the levels for now. In the first part, the enemy encounters are placed much closer to each other than in Commando, but the enemies are also bigger and tougher in comparison. It's also a bit more open than the cramped corridors of the ship you start off on in 2, but enemies are never placed too far apart so that you'll always be able to hit each group with a well-timed nitro launcher or shock blaster shot. It's a more fast-paced shooter with more enemies thrown at you at once, essentially. In the second part, you're dropped into a mini battleground, or more like an arena really, where you'll be assaulted by wave after wave of enemies. There are also some galactic ranger robots there with you who will end up doing most of the work if you let them. This is very distinctly un-Ratchet and Clanky, but it's the tutorial, so I'll let it slide. It's weird though, they give you this big area, but there's nothing hidden here, just a couple of boxes behind one of the destroyed towers. The enemies all spawn near the middle and run towards you, but there are never enough of them coming at you at once for you to have to move around the level at all. This is also thanks to the cover fire from the robots. The music here is supposed to be a reimagining of the Veldin theme from the first game, but I don't know, it doesn't sound much like Veldin at all to me. In fact, most of the music sounds kinda the same. It's fine to have a strong theme throughout the soundtrack, but there are so many songs that mainly use percussion, the cymbals are especially overused, and brass instruments. It's like this with nearly every song that plays during Ratchet gameplay. It's almost as if they try to hammer the gameplay change into the music by making it sound more frantic and boisterous during his segments. Both the songs that plays during Metropolis and Veldin are actually pretty good examples of this, since they were also in the first game, although the Metropolis score isn't that much different. Like, could you imagine the uproar if they actually made any significant changes to one of the most beloved music tracks on the PS2? I've been listening to the complete soundtrack on repeat while at work these past few days, and it's not that I mind the new direction that much, it's more that I can't tie a song to a level the same way I can with the previous two despite having listened to it this much. Like, it fits the gameplay pretty well, but I wish we got more unique sounding tracks like Florana and Starship Phoenix in Ratchet's levels too, because as it is, most of the musical variety happens during the Clank sections and mid-comics. In a way, I guess the word I'm looking for is generic, but I don't feel quite comfortable describing the score as a whole that way, so I'll just move on from this digression before I take in even more water and it ends up over my head. After Veldin, you're sent to Florana, and this is the first proper classic Ratchet and Clank level. Interestingly, it has a lot in common with the second level of Going Commando, Uzla. In addition to the same color palette, only with a slightly lighter atmosphere, it has platforms suspended in water that you'll need to jump across, flying bug enemies, and enemies that jump out of the water to get you. Despite this obvious reuse of ideas, I actually think this is a pretty great level. Uzla was essentially a couple of closed-off corridors that led to some small open rooms now and then, but Florana's level design is much more dynamic and open, with ladders, zip lines, and small side paths. It feels much more like a proper rack level than Uzla, despite not having any alternate paths you can go down, and it's great to see a return to this kind of design after the closed-off hallways of so many of the Going Commando levels. Well, until you enter the path of death, at least, then it turns back into going hallway again. Just for a little bit, though. And I don't actually think it's that bad. It's a fun little platforming challenge, which is also great to see. I just wish it was more integrated into the main level, but hey, beggars can't be choosers. The enemies throughout the level goes kinda easy on you, and that's fitting for a first big level. They use these boomerangs that travels in a set trajectory, which range is pretty short, all things considered, so they'll have to run up close to you to attack. And this gives you enough time to react to them. They won't start placing out enemies that will throw boomerangs at you until a little bit into the level either, so you're used to what it takes to kill them at that point. This level also introduces two new mechanics. Well, one of them, not really. The first one is the jackpot crate, which when broken will double your bolts and weapon experience for a limited time. This one's actually pretty fun and gives you access to a bolt multiplier outside of challenge mode, with the added benefit of it also doubling your weapon XP, something the multiplier in challenge mode does not. The extra fun part though is that it multiplies your multiplier in challenge mode. So while that multiplier normally caps at 20, it can go up to 40 with the use of a jackpot crate. Smashing a bunch of crates is already an addicting feeling with your multiplier at 20, now imagine doing it with your multiplier at 40. It's pure video game crack and really gives you an incentive to play well whenever you know there's one coming up. There's also no worse feeling than getting hit while in the middle of a collecting spree and watch the multiplier dwindle back down to 2. Truly an emotional roller coaster if there ever was one. It's a shame though that most of these crates are placed kind of out of the beaten path. They're usually placed in a way where you won't get a lot out of them. There's either no crates, no enemies, or a minor lack of both. And because of that, it rarely feels like you get to utilize the jackpot crate to its full potential. I think maybe the devs thought it was more OP than it actually is. I mean, it is extremely, almost overwhelmingly effective when you have that 40 times multiplier going. But for one, that's only in challenge mode, and two, that's only if you've managed to get to it without having gotten hit for a while. It's like they balanced it for the highest possible potential when in reality you'll end up breaking a few boxes here and killing a few enemies there, and then walk to the next encounter as you listen to the beeping signaling that the effect is about to go out without a single box or enemy in the vicinity. Oh well, it's at least much better than the Inferno crate. When you break this one, Ratchet automatically gets equipped with the Infernox armor, the last armor you can buy and which is only available in challenge mode. Only your wrench also gets a flame effect unique to when you break the crate. You also get invincibility and a wrench in your left hand as well in the duration of the power-up. The kicker though is that you can't use your other weapons, just the Omni wrench. I really shouldn't have to explain why this is a terrible idea, but here it goes. Why would you ever want to activate this? It's Ratchet and Clank. You're supposed to kill enemies with your weapons to level them up. Killing them with your wrench just wastes weapon experience. You can't even use the second wrench either, it's just there for show. The animations of Ratchet swinging it around doesn't even change at all. Jesus Christ, you know it's bad when the best thing about the crate is that you can't accidentally shoot it with a weapon since it can only be broken by getting hit directly with the Omni wrench. After Florana, you're introduced to Starship Phoenix, the hub, I guess. It's not really much of a hub though in a gameplay sense. It's more for the sake of the story, since the only non-story thing you'll be coming back here for is the armor vendor. I guess there's also the VR arena, but if you actually like that one, I'm legitimately worried about your mental state. Like, the reward for the last challenge is 2000 bolts and a titanium bolt. The rewards and weapon EXP are so bad that you almost might as well go replay Florana. One thing I feel I should mention though is that the song that plays here is god tier, and it's like one of the only ones in the entire game that I can instantly recognize where it's from. Other than listening to the theme, there's not really much to do here, but you rarely spend a lot of time on Starship Phoenix anyways, and you're pretty quickly sent on your way soon after you arrive most of the time. The next planet is Marcadia, and this starts out as a seemingly normal rack level, but you're given 2 robot companions that, yet again, will do most of the work for you early on if you let them. This is also the first instance of the jackpot crate being wasted thanks to the lack of enemies and the space needed to travel between them, the crates in the room and the next room. The setup on Florana was actually more of an outlier. This is how it usually is. Anyway, even though the first third of the level is relatively short, it still feels like a fully fledged level with secrets to find and some entertaining combat sections. When you get to the end though, that's pretty much it, and you're thrust into yet another battleground scenario. I'm not the biggest fan of these, and I'll outline why a little later, but these ones I don't mind that much. The worst I can say about them is that the endless onslaught of enemies gets a bit boring after a while, since all the battleground missions here takes place in the same area as one another. But they introduce different objectives for each one. It's just that they all boil down to defending the same enemies in the same place over and over again. You do get forced into a turret for mission 3, but again, it's the same here as with the Inferno crate. You're not playing this game to use a generic turret, you're playing it to use all the awesome weapons in your arsenal. Besides, I got enough turret gameplay for a lifetime from going commando. The last mission is admittedly pretty fun though. You have to run around and activate these turrets one by one by turning the bolt cranks in the right order. All in all, it's a pretty effective tutorial battleground to prepare you for what's to come later. Sadly, they won't be as imaginative as this one is. After the battleground, you're sent into the laser defense facility, where you'll find the refractor. This is a gadget that lets you, well, refract lasers. The first set of puzzles for it does a pretty good job of explaining how it works. It's just that it never gets much more complex than this. It's also demonstrated that you can use the reflected beams as a weapon, and you can even reflect the laser beams from these big guys right back at them. It's very niche, but it's actually good to know for a couple of parts, like in Blackwater City. A lot of people claim that these puzzles make them feel smart for figuring them out, but I never really got that feeling from them. They're pretty basic puzzles, all things considered, with literally no chance at doing something in the wrong order where you'd have to reset the puzzle or something. I don't know, maybe I just have 1,000 IQ. But then again, they literally give you the answer to the hardest part almost right away. So it isn't really the masterclass of puzzle design that a lot of people make it out to be. Afterwards, to make up for all the mind-churning puzzles, I guess, you're introduced to this game's arena, Annihilation Nation. What? I missed something? No, you must be mistaken. There's no level design between Marcadia and Annihilation Nation. For fuck's sake. Alright, fine. You know what? Let's just deal with these all in one go, alright? So, you're not allowed to go to Annihilation Nation until you complete the first issue of the Quark VidComic series. What's the best way to convey this? I mean, the fact these games even exist is a miracle. I'm honestly amazed that Gadgetron hasn't started mass producing these things as weapons, because the Quark VidComics suck so bad that they would easily give the Vortex Cannon a run for its money. In fact, I'm convinced that the first VidComic started out as a weapon replacement for the Suck Cannon, but sucked so bad that they had to tone it down and include the original one from Rack 1 instead. How in the wildest depths of hell did Insomniac, the developers who at this point were renowned worldwide for their 3D platformers, create this steaming pile of garbage? And even weirder still, how did they create 5 of them? The footage truly does not do it justice, because if you think it looks awkward to control, let me tell you, it feels even worse. The jumping is weirdly rigid, but also bouncy somehow. It feels like you should have some momentum while in the air, but you can turn on a dime. Except for the first second after you do a wall jump. In that case, you're locked into the animation, which makes it even weirder to handle than a normal jump. Your ledge grab sometimes doesn't register, and your punches, although you can send them out in a flurry, leaves you weirdly vulnerable in between attacks. The controls here are so weird. I'm like seriously struggling to explain them properly. Oh, if you want to jump and attack? Yeah, okay, let's make that extra awkward. And if you thought the movement and controls were bad, let me tell you about the level design. At one point during the first vidcomic, you encounter a seemingly impossible jump, since the platforms have collision underneath them to prevent you from jumping through them. So if you stop and think about it for a bit, you'll realize that, hey, I can't reach the next platform because I'll bounce off of the platform above if I try to jump. Here's the kicker though, you won't, because at this specific point, they decided to just go fuck it and disable the collision underneath this one platform to allow you to clip through it so that you can make the jump. What? I'm literally speechless. This has nothing to do with Ratchet and Clank. This has nothing to do with anything related to the gameplay of this game. This came so far out of left field that it started out on the right side of the field. If the Clank Zapper was a game, this would be that game, and perhaps the most mind-boggling thing of all, this didn't win the Snow Beast award. Granted, there's nothing in the later ones that screams incompetent quite as loud as this one section, but they're not that far off. In the fourth one, there's a part where you have to choose between two paths. The right one leads to tokens, which you'll need to collect all of to get a titanium bolt and a higher normal bolt reward, while the left one leads to a health upgrade, which you'll need to collect one of in every edition to get a skill point. And you know, you also want the extra health because there's shitty and unfair enemy placement all over the place. The problem is that there's insta-kill, boiling acid rising up below you, and no matter how fast you go before this part, it will always rubber band and end up right beneath you. So you won't have a chance to collect the stuff on the opposite path without dying and doing that part again. It's like they're actively spitting on the ABCs of game design. So no, Al, I don't want to play those shitty comics. Combine that with the presentation, and the fact that this got included in the final game at all is downright embarrassing. At least someone managed to strike the creator of these levels with a baseball bat and take over the project in time to implement a skip feature in challenge mode, because if they didn't, then the replay value of the game would instantly drop to 0, especially considering you have to complete all 5 of these to finish the game. Like, someone obviously played Mega Man X one day and went, oh my god, I really want to make something like this, but I'm stuck working on the new Ratchet and Clank game. But what if they even managed to include a sub-tank, for fuck's sake? You find it at the Zeldin crash site, and all it does is store a couple of nanotech orbs if your health is full, and automatically inject it back into your HP pool when you dip under 20% or something. But what function does it have? You'll already get more HP as you level up, and it's acquired so late in the game that it doesn't really offset having to buy new armor or something. In most cases, it's literally just one extra hit. It feels like they threw it in there because, yeah, whatever, someone made it, so I guess we'll include it. Alright, back to Annihilation Nation. When you arrive, you're thrown right into the Death Course, a new arena concept introduced in Ouya. It's another obstacle course in the style of the Path of Death on Florana, except less imaginative. There's a bunch of these, and spoiler alert, they don't get much better than this first one. All of the different courses are basically the same with some minor adjustments, like you'll go right instead of left, or vice versa at the crossroads, which paths are 100% totally randomly selected. The fact that you keep getting the same path every time, no matter how many times you die, is just a coincidence. I promise. They barely change the enemy placement, and if you're lucky, they might add or even subtract a couple of platforms here or there, but the core stays the same throughout all of them. When you've finished the intro challenge and the one after that, you've basically seen everything, and there are like another 6 of these for you to try and stay awake through. Yeah, I'm not a fan of these. It feels like they're using them to overcompensate for the lack of platforming elsewhere in the game, and that could have worked, just not with the amount of content that they have in them currently. It really does feel like you're playing through the same obstacle course 8 times, and the platforming isn't good enough to carry the burden of the repeated scenery. The real star of the show in the arena, though, have always been, well, the arena fights. You're only required to do the first obstacle and arena course to progress in the story the first time, and then you go back later to complete another set. The rest of the challenges are optional. Well, just like the battleground missions, I like to describe them as semi-optional, since it's the easiest place in the game to farm bolts for new weapons. So if you want the Annihilator early, or, at all, before you're at the end of the game, you're gonna need to complete every one of them. Personally, I really like these challenges. They're mostly mindless fun where you run around and shoot everything that moves, but you'll need to think a bit too. There's a bunch of obstacles that shows up throughout matches, like saw blade fans and lightning emitters on the floor, or a giant Gatling gun that shoots at you from the middle, so you can't turn your brain completely off. In addition, there are special challenges like timed matches, boss matches, hot swap matches, where your weapons are given a much smaller ammunition pool than normal and is randomized whenever you run out, which makes for some pretty dynamic fights. There are also matches where your health is drained gradually, and then during the championship bouts, the challenge mode switches from round to round. So one round might be a timed one, while the next one gives you hot swapping weapons. It's really, really fun. There's also the weapon-specific challenges, where you're given one fully loaded weapon which you need to finish all the rounds with. This one I have some mixed feelings about because it doesn't always work out. If you enter with a V1 weapon, it's most likely impossible to complete, while if it's fully upgraded, it's a walk in the park. They really should have balanced the challenge itself based on the weapon level, because as it is right now, if you want the challenge to be fun, you'll need to know about this beforehand and then take care to level your weapon appropriately for when it's supposed to be used in that one specific challenge, and yeah, that's just not realistic at all. The great thing about the arena is that it perfectly captures the core gameplay loop of the game, which is shooting and upgrading weapons, and then plays around with it by adding modifiers that makes it differ from normal gameplay. I think they do a better job at mixing it up than in Going Commando, but at the same time, it doesn't feel as refreshing here for reasons we will delve into later. Speaking of delving, the next level, Aquatos, takes place in an underwater base of sorts. Most of this level is spent escorting Skid, since he has the hacker and can open the way forwards for you. Oh yeah, there's yet another horrible jackpot crate placement here. It's way in the back of one of the first rooms, so you won't notice it until all of the enemies in the room are dead. And the remaining boxes afterwards really doesn't give you a lot. To top that off, when you open up the door to the next room, the enemy takes ages to spawn, and after you kill that one guard, Skid needs to hack the bridge, and that also takes time. So when you're finally on the other side, the jackpot effect has already evaporated ages ago. Anyways, this also feels like a classic Ratchet and Clank level. Despite being kinda corridory, it's still relatively open. There are big rooms with enemy encounters in them where you'll even be ambushed from behind sometimes. It really does feel kinda like a secret base, a feeling that is reinforced by the hacking and the underwater infiltration segments. It's cool. I like it. You'll also encounter 2 of these giant amoeboids that drops a sewer crystal each when defeated. These will come in handy later, but before that there's a Theronoid and Clank section where you'll switch between playing as Clank and Theronoid Ratchet to proceed through the level. Not at will, of course, that'd just be silly. The Clank sections in Up Your Arsenal have a new gimmick to them: the banana gun and the monkey. How did they get the briefcase with a monkey in it on the other side of the force field, you ask? We don't talk about that. This is a pretty minor change, all things considered. The gist of it is that the monkey will run towards where the banana lands, pick it up, and eat it. This can be applied to button puzzles and having the monkey distract the guards, and that's pretty much it. There's little to no thinking required here. Most of the level is pretty straightforward. The only part that requires some thinking is during the lift part, but even then it all just boils down to monkey go eat banana on Switch. Thanks to the inclusion of the banana gun and scrunch though, they somehow managed to make the Clank sections even more brain dead. Right now, you only have the monkey and the small gadget bots, and the only commands used for the bots are either attack or enter. In an attempt to make the Clank sections more dynamic, they somehow removed even more of the complexity that they had previously with the special gadget bots in Going Commando. This makes Clank's entire gameplay loop in Ouya consist of waiting around for the monkey to do stuff. The Thuranoid sections aren't much better. There's not really any puzzle solving going on here either. All you're doing is walking forwards and pressing buttons in time with the indicator to have a conversation with the real Thuranoids so that they'll open doors or the way forward for Clank. The conversations themselves are pretty funny, I guess, especially whenever you get a button wrong, but there's absolutely no consequence for getting anything wrong, not even a slap on the wrist. You can fail as many times as you like. Apparently, these Thuranoids all have the patience of a saint. These conversations are also some of the most boring stuff you'll do during the entire game, and it only gets worse later on with multiple back and forths between Ratchet and the guards. I think I get why they decided to swap between Clank and Ratchet, because doing either of these segments all in one go would probably make me want to gouge my eyes out of boredom. So we have one good part and one bad part. Will the final part save this level? Is this the magnum opus of the Ratchet and Clank franchise? No, of course not. It's a crystal collecting segment. This one is also semi-optional, which means that you don't really even have to collect the first 2 crystals if you can manage to click past the enemies. They do serve a purpose though, which is to immediately give you a sense of how much you'll get per crystal. It's a lot, which is why I'm labeling this optional content as semi-optional as well. Though, to be fair, you really only need to bother with about half of them, or at least the ones that you can get prior to acquiring the gravity boots. This is a series of pipes that you travel through with crystals and big amoeboids hidden here and there. The big green dudes will be hidden behind unbreakable green slime walls, which has the added function of stopping your progress at some points, making you have to approach the wall from the other side to get to the big guy behind it to break it, essentially forming some sort of shortcut system. Just like in the previous game, this gets infinitely easier after you get the Map-O-Matic, which shows all the crystals you haven't found. But more importantly, it also shows you the hidden second layer. You get there by walking along the tubes that goes up, but you need the gravity boots for that, which presents a whole other problem. The only way to make looking for crystals not suck worse than the suck cannon is to use long jumps or even the charge boots to make movement a bit quicker. That all changes when you get the gravity boots though, since at that point you can't use either of them. And you can't even unequip those boots. Holy fucking shit. This makes the FromHerotoZero crystals by far the worst crystal collecting segment ever. I actually like the pipe layout. It makes it easy to see where you haven't been, even if you don't have the Map-O-Matic, which makes it relatively simple to collect half the crystals on your first visit. I like the idea of being forced to come back later in an effort to space out the collection aspect, but in this case, the execution is beyond horrible. Being forced to use the gravity boots not only takes away all your speed, but it also severely damages your sense of direction if you decide to try and have some fun with it by running around inside the pipe. It's not that bad considering you can just bring up the map and get back on track that way, but damn. Overall, I don't think I've seen anything get ruined, or rather in this case get made this much worse, by implementing one of the coolest and most interesting items in the game. Next up is Thuranosis, and this is the first instance of a purely battleground focused planet. This one also introduces a lot of the problems I have with the battleground segments. You start the level by jumping out of your ship, diving towards the surface. You have to avoid some rockets while in midair, but it's not always clear which of them are targeting you, and some of them likes to come at you from out of the corner of the screen, so those can be pretty hard to avoid, since you need to start moving back and forth a little while before it hits you to throw it off track. Anyways, you meet up with a few robots on your way down, but only 2 of them survive. These 2 will follow you through the first part of the level, and just like in Marcadia, they will do all the work for you if you let them, which yet again is very not in the spirit of the Ratchet and Clank games. I gotta say though that there's a very well placed jackpot crate here, right before a big room with lots of enemies and crates in it, so at least there's one positive thing to get excited about. After this, you arrive at a big open field where you're presented with a car. And not just a car, but a car with a roof-mounted turret operated by a monkey. Yeah, because that's just what I want in my third-person RPG shooter. Cars. Someone must have played a bit too much Halo when designing these. I mean, some of these levels, dude, holy shit! The car can actually get destroyed too, so if it does, you'll have to run all the way back and forth on this giant plane with nothing on it. To be fair though, that's not very likely to happen thanks to the monkey gunning down everything in sight, so the car is only really used as a means to get around quickly since you now have 4 different objectives scattered around the map, and you mostly get to these objectives by foot anyways, and these sections are actually pretty good. They have some interesting enemy setups here that lets you play around with the flux rifle for once, or find different ways of dealing with them. For example, you can put up a shield while fighting these 2 dudes and shoot them with the sniper. Just straight up gun them down or jump down below them to get around the back. The level design opens up some interesting possibilities like that. You'll even need to do a bit of platforming during some of the routes. What I don't like though are the places where they'll put enemies high up on some tall platforms or in the air so that you can't auto-lock on them. You'll need to stop and use the first person mode to aim at them, but that's sometimes not possible without getting hit. Some of the devs have said that the optimal way to play the game is with the lock strafe mode, where you can manually aim your reticule upwards, but I hate it since it makes the platforming feel like shit. It's not hard enough to reach these high enemies that it's a problem, neither does it happen frequently enough either, but it's kind of funny to me that the recommended way to play the game purely benefits the combat while making everything else shitty. I guess that's why you're able to turn it on and off with the quick select menu if you can spare the space, which I couldn't. Also, why even bother with the lock-on mods if you're supposed to use lock strafe, but I digress. The next part is a boss battle, but we'll talk more about those later. For now, let's take a look at the optional battleground missions. The first mission is fine. It has some annoying enemies in the form of the winner of this game's Snow Beast Award, these rocket launchers that shoot missiles at you that has a weird attack pattern. But overall, if all the battleground missions were laid out like this, I'd be more of a fan. Sadly though, this stops abruptly with the inclusion of a hovership in the second mission. And that is where I usually stop. The problem here is that this is another instance of something that doesn't tie into the gameplay of the series at all. If I wanted to fly a spaceship, I'd go play Star Fox. It has nothing to do with anything else. I know that there were not only vehicles but also space battles in Going Commando, but this time the vehicles are more integrated into the main game, and every instance in which you need to use one feels wrong. You're not supposed to shoot down enemies from a ship in Ratchet and Clank. You're supposed to be using your own weapons and upgrade them, right? The space battles in 2 were also never around for long. There were 1 required mission per area, and that was it. I think the use of vehicles are fine when you use them in races or as something optional like a means of looking for raritanium on the crystal collecting planets. But when the use of vehicles, or a different mechanic for that matter, are so closely tied to the core gameplay that it steals a part of what makes the game what it is, then you're not designing into the game's strengths, you're bloating it. The vehicles in past games, like the bike and the spaceship, were also used as minigames to give the player a bit of breathing room, or a breath of fresh air as it was, between the levels, and that's not really the case here since it's part of the core game and not a distraction. This isn't as clear here since the missions themselves are optional, but there are a couple more battleground missions later that are part of the main story that will force you into a hovership. Anyways, let's go on to an actual good Right, I forgot about the VR training course. You'll need to beat this to gain access to the Hypershot and the Hacker. Both are gadgets you'll need on Dax. To begin with, the Hypershot is the swing shot and the dynamo combined into one gadget. Both of them works identical to their earlier counterparts. I really wish they'd use the swing shot more though. Thanks to the shift in gameplay focus, they don't really do a lot of fun stuff with it this time around, and it's mostly relegated to being a key for progression since you can't get into the main part of Dax without it. The one change they made to it, which also affects the dynamo part of the gadget, is that it will auto-equip whenever you get near a target. I can't get myself to trust it 100% though. It's kinda buggy in a sense where it'll randomly not work, though this happens more with dynamo targets. The dynamo is still a glorified button, and it's also used less, thankfully. I kinda like the Hacker though. It's a simple enough puzzle gadget where you'll need to collect the green and destroy the red. The first few puzzles can be a bit boring, but when they really get going with them, they're quite fun. The only part I don't like is when they start doing 3 or 4 rounds per Hacker pad every time. At that point, it can get a bit much, but even though it's the only minigame lock opener, it's never overused. I think that one of the positives of the shift to a more action-oriented game is the scaling back on gadgets like these. I never downright hated any of the other ones, the closest to hated being probably the Infiltrator, but I've never been the biggest fan of them either. Actually, none of the puzzle gadgets in Ratchet and Clank games are especially good, fun to use, or well designed, and even in the first game it felt like they were shoehorned in there. Actually, I kinda do like the tractor beam, but most of the puzzles that are related to these gadgets are way too simple for me to get a lot of enjoyment out of them. If I do, it's usually in the later ones that tends to be harder. I understand that this is because the game's target demographic is kids, so the logic and skill puzzles can't be super hard or complex, but whenever they introduce a puzzle, I can feel the developers waver, as if they don't quite know or understand what they want the game to be. It feels like they keep adding in these puzzles because the first game had them. It's weird that they keep adding them, since they've pretty much completely moved on from that game's core values, and as a result, you get a very jarring experience whenever you encounter a puzzle, especially when it's in the middle of an action-packed level. Anyways, back to Dax. This is probably the greatest level in the game. To begin with, there are a whopping 3 different paths to choose from. Holy shit! They all have a lot of combat in them, and pretty much all of the encounters are great. The main one features a lot of destructible cover, which both you and your enemies can use. The enemies here are some kind of commando robot thing. I think their attacks are lifted straight from the commandos in Rack 1. They shoot a bunch of tiny shots in a row at you, so they're not hard to avoid, but there's usually a lot of them gathered in one place, and when they start to add in these huge flying robots with Gatling guns for arms, you'll really have to start to think about where to hide or where to jump so that you won't land on any of the projectiles. This adds another layer to the fights, where you have to think about which enemy to take down first. Do you remove the small and easy to kill ones so that it's easier to move around, or the big tough ones so that you don't have to move around so much? They also set up the encounters so that you can basically use most of the weapons here. Even the Infector can be used without much trouble. The secondary path leads to a hypershot course where you're swinging and jumping from platform to platform while simultaneously getting attacked by a hovercraft. It'll shoot missiles at you that will break any of the fan platforms if they hit them, but sometimes will just straight up hit you from nowhere. It's either a bug or an unseen attacker kind of deal, but either way it's kind of BS, especially in challenge mode where you'll suddenly lose your bolt multiplier for seemingly no reason. This is the only time the hypershot is used in this capacity, and that kinda sucks because this is really fun. They even managed to apply the dynamo to it in a satisfying way, so it at least shows that they're capable of making something good with it. At the end, you fight the hovership, and I'll talk a bit about it here because it's basically more a part of the platforming challenge than it is a boss battle. It'll still shoot missiles at you, which you need to dodge, and that can destroy the outer platforms, but it'll also do a sweeping laser attack, which can be tricky to jump over, so you're better off trying to avoid the platform during the missile part and then using them liberally during the laser part. Other than that, it might have a tad bit too much HP since those are the only attacks it has, but hey. The last path is purely an optional one, and it's pretty short as well, with the charge boots waiting as your prize at the end. Despite being short though, this is by far the hardest path, with a bunch of those big torso robots coming at you at once without any strategic cover in sight. I guess it makes sense then that the Holoshield glove becomes available to buy once you land on Dax. The outcome of fully completing Dax is that you now have a branching story path. You'll need to complete both branches to continue on, but it's still refreshing to actually have some options of where you want to go for once. You can head to the Obani Moons or head back to Annihilation Nation to meet with Courtney Gears, after which you open up the last set of arena challenges. I went to the Obani Moons first, for some reason. I guess I really didn't want money for the Annihilator or something. Anyways, this level consists of 2 parts, both taking place within the spherical level concept that was introduced in Going Commando. The first one is a huge refractor puzzle, where you're redirecting a laser beam across the entire planet to shut down a force field that hinders your progress towards the next part. I gotta say, I thought the spherical level thing was a neat concept in Going Commando, but it turned out to be more of a novelty since there wasn't really anything that was done differently compared to normal levels, except that you could naturally loop around the level. It seems like they realized this and only included one instance of it, so it ended up being more of a cool and refreshing experience, but nothing else. In Ouya, they build on it with the refractor puzzle, a puzzle that couldn't really be done with a normal level layout, partly thanks to the map and partly thanks to the design. It's not much of a puzzle, but you need to redirect a laser beam across the entire level by using these satellites. When you hit one of them, they'll shoot the beam towards the next location, and you'll need to do the same thing there, and so on. The reason why this works so well, and is actually surprisingly fun, is because when you press the map button, instead of bringing up a plain 2D map, you're given a 3D interactive map of the entire globe you're on. This is a snapshot of how everything looks that is created the second you press R3, or select, so you can actually see where the laser beam ends up and use them to find where the next satellite is. I really like it, and it would never look this good, or even work at all, on your standard level plane. It actually needs to be a spherical planet for it to work, since having a set boundary within the level would have made the back and forth kinda tedious, but the ability to simply loop in whichever direction makes it far better than just tolerable. It's great. The next part is also a spherical planet, but it's more in the style of a classic level. They still use the concept for what it's worth though, by utilizing a lot of jump pads that usually launch you way higher into the air than is needed to let you look out towards the horizon and the curvature of the planet, or moon, or whatever. One thing I'd like to make special note of is that they seem to have improved visibility this time around. I don't know if it's because they made the curvature less steep or just because the area has more light or less clutter though. It's hard to tell when comparing footage. The next level we'll handle is Blackwater City. Sadly, it's just another battleground. No hoverboarding today, I guess. These missions are mostly fine, though they're more like glorified arena battles, with enemy waves spawning at set points around an enclosed area. You get to hear the Blackwater City music while fighting, I guess, so that's cool. You get the gravity boots as a reward, and after that the only thing left to do is meeting with Miss Gears. But the first part of that is just an arena gauntlet, so let's skip ahead to Hollow Star Studios. Yet another two-parter. The first part is a Clank section where you play the role as Secret Agent Clank on a film set. First off, I want to mention that the director will treat each death as a failed take, and he'll also provide direction throughout the level, which is a nice touch. But what surprised me is that they recorded unique voice lines, not only for take 1, 3, and 5.
Alright, this is the part where you take out the henchman, then chase Maximilian out of the bar. Try to make it look real, alright? Action! Maximilian Strikes Back, take 3, and action! Maximilian Strikes Back, take 5, and action!
But number 7 and 12 also, and he becomes increasingly exasperated. It's so fucking funny.
Maximilian Strikes Back, take 7, and action! Maximilian Strikes Back, take 12, and action!
The level itself isn't anything special, it's just like the other one. You merely stand around for the most part and wait for the monkey to do the important stuff. There is, however, a giant Clank fight at the end, but like the ones in Going Commando, it's not very fun. After you've damaged the boss a bit, he'll run away and send out some giant ninja enemies you'll need to defeat to get him to come back. While the spectacle itself is fun, the boss and the mobs have a bit too much health, and they can all be defeated by spamming the punch or missile button anyway, so it's not like there's any special strategies to use here either. At least it doesn't take place on a spherical planet this time. The second part is a classic level again, but without Clank. Not that it really matters at all. This one is very combat focused with narrow hallways, lots of enemies, and lots of cover. So it gives you an opportunity to use your more tactical weapons like the suck cannon, hollow shield glove, or the flux rifle. It does have some BS enemy placement though, like enemies waiting for you behind a door and then shooting the instant it opens, giving you almost a whole half of a second to try and avoid them. This is also where we get somewhat of a difficulty spike. It's essentially the game warning you that it's time to buy the new weapons if you haven't already. It's nice that the game branches out in different paths, but ultimately it doesn't matter which path you choose first, since it won't have any effect on anything, not even the story. Though I guess the story does make a bit more sense if you do the Obani Moons first, but we'll talk about that more in the story section. Anyways, like I said, it doesn't matter which path you choose, since both needs to be completed before they converge again at the Obani Draco. This is yet another classic linear level, though there's a much bigger focus on platforming challenges here. A lot of them also involve the newly acquired gravity boots. It also looks absolutely awesome. Like these colors, the spotlights that swerve towards you when you get near, the speakers pumping out this techno tune that totally fits the surroundings, whatever this spiraling hall of TVs are supposed to be, and the giant disco ball in the center of a huge room. It's an almost overwhelming visual spectacle, but there's nothing else in the entire game that looks like it. They also introduced strafing via help desk message at the end of it for some reason. It's not a very long level. For some people I suspect that's a good thing because of the visual overstimuli, and they might be right, honestly. Still though, I really like it, if just for how it's not the usual combat heavy gameplay as a lot of the other levels. Like the next one, Southern Starport. This level utilizes a lot of the ninja enemies outside of the arena. These guys will hunt you down and slash you with an attack that is pretty hard to avoid if you give them the chance to try and hit you. Some of them will also throw shuriken at you as a ranged attack, but most ninjas at Southern Port will be melee attackers that complement the ranged killbots or whatever. This means that you'll need to think about how to best handle enemy encounters. The melee attackers will circumvent cover such as the hollow shields and sometimes the physical ones too, while the ranged attackers will shoot you from afar to limit your movement. It's a simple tactic that is also used in a less effective manner in the arena battles, but here they take it to the next level by not only increasing the speed of the melee enemies, but also by making them extremely agile, which makes them hard to hit with single target non-AoE weapons like the Flux Rifle or the N60 Storm while they're charging at you or jumping around. Even the Spitting Hydra has trouble hitting these guys. Combining them with the long-range commandos makes these encounters particularly deadly, but in addition, they include the sniper enemies from the Holostar Studios in some encounters. These hit like trucks, and also have bombs that they throw towards you to flush you out when you're behind cover. All of this makes the encounters in Southern Starport very dynamic and tons of fun, but it's at this point where the difficulty spike really starts to rear its head. There are a lot of enemies here, and they can take a lot of punishment. This is me trying to kill the first wave of the level with the V4 version of the N60 Storm, and yeah, it's kinda miserable, using almost 50 units of ammunition to take down 3 enemies. It's not like the other early game weapons fare much better either. Even using the V4 Nitro launcher, you'll need to hit them with at least 3 blasts to destroy them. If Holostar Studios was the first warning, then this is your last, because hey, would you look at that, this level actually has 2 different paths to choose from. It's just that there's no way you'll notice it because of how they angle the camera when you land. The optional path ends with finding the Bolt Grabber V2, which now incorporates both the Bolt Grabber and the Box Breaker from Going Commando. The game gets so much more free after this. The normal radius for the bolt pickup isn't that bad, but it always feels like you have to go out of your way a lot to pick them up, which again kinda limits the action feeling that Insomniac wants to incite in this game. It's kinda hard to uphold the action flow when you stop for a bit in every room to go around and break boxes. They mostly do a good job of placing these boxes in your path, but then you also have these big rooms with boxes in every corner, and like I've already gone on a rant about, you'll want to break all of these to properly save up bolts for the extremely expensive weapons in the second half of the game. The Box Breaker also improves the flow, or rather it removes the need to deplete the ammunition of big area dominating weapons to maintain it, with the added benefit of also crushing every breakable object in the same effective area. Normally, you'd want to use the Omnivrench for this since it doesn't require any ammunition and is essentially free to use, and using something like the Nitro Launcher to break boxes doesn't make a lot of sense because of the limited ammo capacity of the weapon. It's a shame that the Bolt Grabber doesn't appear until the last third of the game, because not only isn't there anything that feels as satisfying as seeing a bunch of litter and bolts fly out from everywhere around you after using a Hyper Strike, but it also helps with the aforementioned action flow since you now no longer have to run all the way up to the boxes to break them with your wrench. You can just do a jump strike and all the bolts will fly right at you from a frankly ridiculous distance. So yeah, they 100% didn't show you the main path on purpose. Not only because they definitely wanted you to acquire the Bolt Grabber, but also because the Leviathan is chock full of enemies, even more so than in the Starport itself. It's not that long of a level, but it can be intense, if you let it. It can also be a perfect example of why the tactical weapons make the game kinda boring. They're also exceptionally useless during the escape sequence. There's suddenly a ton of enemies again, even if you defeated them all before, and a timer that when reaches 0 means instant game over, I think. I never really let it run out. You only have a minute to get back to the ship, and honestly, this means that you're not going to want to fight any of the enemies anyways, especially not with these weak-ass early game pieces of shit. Our prize for escaping is having to play all the Quark vid comics that hasn't been completed yet, even though only playing the 4th one would give us the clue needed to proceed to Metropolis, and
I heard somebody has the latest vid comic in the Quark vs. Nefarious series.
oh my god, Al, would you shut up? There literally haven't been enough time between when I got it until now that I could even have made it to the fucking game console. Sheesh. Metropolis is the first planet, not counting Veldin, that's actually reminiscent of its counterpart in Ratchet and Clank 1. Yet another classic level, of course, and after the Theranoids gets turned into robots, this is where the actual difficulty spike kicks in. The enemies get tougher yet again, and they also get smarter, implementing surprise attacks into their strategies even. Although some of these are kinda BS and unfair. At this point, you're better off just using the new weapons. The N90 Hurricane, for example, won't do much against even the medium enemies. And forget about using the Plasma Whip. This thing literally won't even make them flinch. Instead, weapons like the Disc Blade Gun will take down the medium enemies in one hit, even at level 1. And the Rift Inducer can take down an entire group with one shot. The enemies also deal a ton more damage, and there's a bunch of big ones like dropships and tanks and whatnot, so if you don't want to die, you're almost required to use the strongest weapons you have available. This severely limits your options, and honestly, because the enemies deal so much damage, the entire level ends up kinda boring when you're forced to use your most powerful weapons, which mostly tear the enemies apart. I mean, I gave it a shot, but I kept dying, so eventually I just said fuck it and ran through the entire thing using the Rift Inducer. The only thing I did was move forward and press shoot, only changing to the Disc Blade when I encountered enemies that couldn't be sucked up by the black hole. It's a shame, because while it's not the longest level, it's pretty fun thanks to all the varied combat encounters. Even the fight against Giant Clunk is pretty good. There are some optional battleground missions here though, most of which involve the hovercraft, and yeah, I've already gone on about how I don't like that thing. Ironically, this is also the level where Ouya starts to feel like a Ratchet and Clank game. Not just because of this level in particular, but also because of all the levels that comes next. It's banger after banger at this point. First we have the Celdran crash site, the site of the crashed Leviathan on planet Celdran, Nefarious' Leviathan. Yet another fun classic type level. There's a bunch of enemies here too, and they're all pretty tough, but this time they start to play around more with designing the level to take advantage of the enemies' strengths. They'll not only give them a tactical advantage by placing enemies on higher ground, making it harder to target them with certain weapons, but enemies like the giant torsos are now placed at the end of tight corridors, which make their shots really hard to avoid. It's not as consistently intense as Metropolis, but it'll still make you sweat. Oh, actually, forget about the banger after banger part, I completely forgot about Iridia. There's another split path here where you can choose to either go to Iridia or play the 5th issue of the Quark vidcomic and head to Quark's hideout. God, it's like choosing between being bit by a bullet ant or a black widow. Iridia does start out okay. The first mission is a fairly short linear level with nothing much going on, but the second one is the first instance of a required battleground mission forcing you into a hovercraft. Actually, it's the only instance of it, which makes something else in the game that comes up a bit later kinda awkward. Anyways, if you're still curious as to why I hate the hovercraft, and pretty much the car too I guess, just look at this extremely engaging and not boring at all gameplay that's 100% totally in line with everything else you do in the game. Yeah. Mission 3 and 4 both takes place in the open area in the middle of the map and also features the car. They're more boring than anything else, but the last mission is kinda exciting. It's a linear path, but it has a bunch of enemies in tight corridors that are hard to dodge and ends with 2 turrets that you need to destroy. If it weren't for the vehicle parts, this would have actually been an okay battleground. The reward is the warp pad and, well, it's used a total number of like 2 times. Both instances of which are in Quark's hideout. Yeah, when they gave you the option to go here first, they didn't mention anything about needing the warp pad, so there being a branching path was a complete and utter lie. That's nice. And here I was, about to praise the game for having some good kind of variety. It's a shame that the warp pad was tossed aside like this, because I think it has the potential to be used in some interesting puzzles. I guess they just ran out of time at this point and had to shove what they had in here. Other than that, this is a pretty cool level. Get it? Because it has eyes in it? Sadly, with ice, there also comes ice physics, but it's not used in a way that it's too annoying. The enemy encounters are still holding up, surprisingly, and the ice physics makes some of the fights more interesting by messing with your controls. They've gradually been upping the difficulty like this all along, and I appreciate immensely that they're not just making the enemies sturdier or more powerful, but actually changing the landscape itself to provide new and fresh challenges in a neat and proper manner. They don't start doing this until the last fourth of the game either, when they've probably realized that it's not enough to just give them more health and firepower, because if they did, they'd completely ruin the power balance of the weapons yet again. There's this one cool part in particular where you need to jump down towards a laser that is spinning around on an ice platform with enemies standing on the elevated platforms around it. It looks simple enough at first glance, but it's really a tough challenge because it limits your movement so much. The action is sadly broken up by a Clank segment though, and while the first 3 minutes aren't bad, you'll soon find the monkey and it all yet again devolves into waiting for him to do shit. After this, you're sent straight to Starship Phoenix. This is a pretty fun level, if only for the fact that you get to explore the starship in a new way. Instead of heading to the bridge by elevator, you'll have to walk there while fighting a bunch of ninjas. There's not really a lot of new stuff happening here though. They mostly incorporate the same combat encounter philosophy, only they've upped the ante with the amount of ninjas compared to previously. And these ones have both ranged shuriken attacks and melee attacks, making them very adaptable to Ratchet's movement. They also have a tendency to bug out a lot. There's one part that sticks out to me right at the end though, where they place this big dude that's basically the equivalent of a torso robot kind of far away and then a bunch of ninjas close to you. This becomes yet another question of which enemy to destroy first to make it easier for you. They create these kinds of setups a lot throughout the game actually, but it's these kinds of areas that makes it more obvious and also easier to appreciate. You can't go wrong with choosing either the ninjas or the big dude really. It depends on what you're more comfortable with. The big dude's attack is more consistent and is easier to hit, while the ninjas will jump around and switch from melee to ranged depending on your positioning. It's a fun setup. Next up, the penultimate level, Planet Koros. This is basically combat encounter the level. There's an incredible amount of enemies here, and some even spawn endlessly. Well, I don't know if that's 100% true, but they do keep coming for a while after you've seemingly destroyed them all. They do a lot here that is very tactical, like using these big brutes to shoot out rockets that you'll need to avoid as the smaller robots shoot at you. This is also the first time the big brutes are used, at least with the rocket launcher feature, so they make sure to properly introduce that enemy by itself early on. Other than that, they also deploy pretty much all of the earlier strategies that were introduced previously. It's yet another solid level and great for upgrading weapons because of the sheer amount of enemies here. Like seriously, there are so many bad guys. This was most likely intentional though, as Chronos seems to have been a response to the player being underleveled at that point in the game, and Insomniac decided to add the planet to give the players a place to grind up their weapons and health. There's also a ridiculous amount of bolts in the breakables here. I mean, look at the amount you get from breaking just a couple of tables. And it's appreciated, because the next planet is the last one, and it's a toughie. You start out being pitted against two of the largest Theronoids, and then a couple of three-eyed ones. It's immediately obvious that these guys aren't your normal Theronoids. They're way tougher. Even the V5 Annihilator has trouble bringing down the three-eyed ones. It's a fitting amount of difficulty, but I don't think this would have been any fun if you didn't have Chronos inserted beforehand. Because, yeah, it's that much of a difference. It's a combat heavy stage, but the action is interrupted at certain points by Theroguys, Refractor, and Hacker puzzles. I really like the Hacker ones by this point since they're actually getting kinda hard and have a bit more urgency to them, but the Theroguys ones are still barely considered puzzles. They basically just increased the amount of buttons you have to press and the length you have to keep them pressed sometimes, while shortening the time between button presses. While this does make them go by faster, there are also more parts to the conversations, which in a way makes them even worse than previously. There's also a single refractor puzzle, but just like the others, there's not really any way to fail it since you can only do things in a certain order. You just have to figure out what to do first, which is also not very hard. I mean, it's literally right there. Anyways, despite the enemies being kinda hard, there aren't that many combat encounters in between the puzzle sections. It turns what would have been a fun final bash before the last boss into somewhat of a drag, honestly. The inclusion of the Theroguys puzzles especially contributing to this feeling. These last few levels are maybe some of the best levels in Ratchet and Clank so far, which is why it's such a shame that the rest of the game kinda sucks. My biggest problem with Ouya doesn't mainly have to do with the levels themselves, but more with the level pacing. To fully illustrate this point, let's go over the order of which you tackle the different planets. First, there's Velden, the tutorial, but for this example I'll classify it as a battleground level. Then there's Florana, which is an open classic rack level with an obstacle course tacked on at the end. But what differentiates this one compared to the others is that it feels more like a part of the level than a side thing. Skipping Starship Phoenix, since nothing really happens there, we jump to Marcadia, which is an almost purely battleground-based level, but with a small classic section, which is actually really good, leading up to the missions and a short puzzle afterwards. The brunt of the level does take place in a battleground though. After this, there's Annihilation Nation, which is the arena and obstacle course challenges. Then there's Aquatos, a classic rack level. Afterwards, there's Tyrannosis, a battleground. Dax, a classic level. Obani Gemini, 1 part spherical world puzzle and 1 part spherical world classic level. Back to Annihilation Nation, Hollow Studios, half part Clank level, half part classic one. Blackwater City, purely battleground. Obani Draco, short classic level. Zeldin Starport, classic level. Metropolis, classic level. Crash Site, classic level. Iridia, battleground. Quark's Hideout, classic. Starship Phoenix, classic. Koros, classic with a bunch of combat encounters. Command Center, puzzle bonanza with a touch of combat. So basically it goes battleground, classic, battleground, arena, classic, battleground, classic, spherical, classic, arena, classic, battleground, classic, 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 battleground, classic, 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 whatever command center is supposed to be. The game is so incredibly front-loaded with battleground and arena missions that it doesn't feel like it gets going until the last third. For the first 2/3, it never feels like they're able to settle on a style of gameplay. Even the battlegrounds vary wildly in content, with some working more like arena challenges and others as open world missions. The problem is that these are not the levels you're playing a Ratchet and Clank for. That would be the classic levels, right? I mean, the other games had stuff like this too, like the arena and going commando, or hoverboard races in one, but those were not only meant to work as a change of pace, a breath of fresh air, a pause in the same old gameplay loop, but they also had the classic rack level design backing them up. You actually had to run through a level to get to those parts. That's pretty much non-existent in Ouya. You're mostly just plopped right in, and when these small breathers start to become a larger part of the game than the original gameplay, then that poses the question of whether the developers actually knows what makes a Ratchet and Clank game feel like Ratchet and Clank. That's just me being a bit facetious though, because I truly believe that they do know what it takes, and you don't have to look further than the classic levels for proof of that. I honestly think these levels are some of the best rack levels in the entire PS2 trilogy. However, the fact of the matter is that the level pacing sucks ass, and it's a detriment to the rest of the game. I didn't even include the Quark vidcomics in there, which you need to clear the first 4 of before you're allowed to go to Metropolis, and the last 5th one before you can go to the hideout. So in reality, you also need to clear these in between, making the pacing even worse still. There's also the different puzzles you encounter during the levels that does their part in this whole charade, because while the classic levels are all a joy to play through, some of them are also bogged down by unimaginative or downright insulting puzzles that either doesn't challenge the player or just drains all the excitement out of replaying them. I've already said that I really like the hacker, but with the caveat that I only like it when it gets going, which doesn't happen until a little while into the game. Other than that though, there's not really anything exciting going on here when it comes to the puzzles or the gadgets. The refractor looks fun, but like I mentioned, the puzzles themselves are almost laughably easy, with it being almost impossible to do anything wrong in most of them, and all they end up doing is halting the game, pushing it into some sort of slow mode. I like the spherical world puzzle, but other than that, it doesn't really mix with the core gameplay, just like the Theurgeist doesn't. This is what I was referring to when I said downright insulting. It's a rhythm game. I don't know what else to say, it's just a really boring rhythm game. Yeah, still going. This mesh in gameplay is true for the Clank sections too. It's just that they somehow made these even slower than they were in the other games, since most of the gameplay, if you can call it that, boils down to waiting for a monkey to activate switches or distracting enemies instead of finding clever ways of doing it yourself. Like I mentioned, these sections are inserted into the classic levels here and there, and they for the most part only serve to make the levels less enjoyable. The entire first half of Hollow Studios, for example, is a Clank level and naturally brings with it the problems a Clank level has. It's the same in Quark's Hideout, and I don't think I have to provide another example of the Theurgeist gameplay, now do I? The Hypershot was a nice addition, if only for how it now auto-equips when you're near a swingshot or dynamo target, though it's either underused as the swingshot or not being done anything special with as the other thing that I never remember the name of. Sapinator. No, I literally just wrote it down in the last sentence. Whatever, it's as forgettable in the game as its name is anyways. The point is that all you do is yet again press the circle button to activate stuff. It's like they brought it over from the last game because it was in the last game, despite the gadget not working there either, which makes it kinda weird then that there's not a single grind rail segment in here. They might as well not have brought back the swing shot either, because all it really does is prevent you from completing DAX before you've got the hacker. Why even bother with the swing shot if you're not going to do anything fun with it? It's literally the best thing about the first two games. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating a bit. I'm thinking it may be because of the shift in gameplay focus that they decided to cut down on the swing shot stuff and completely remove grind rails. But then again, you have the obstacle courses in the arena that are supposed to scratch that itch, but which ultimately turn out to be very one-sided and shallow experiences when they could have properly used both parts of the hypershot and even added some grinding sections instead. They could maybe even have incorporated some of the other gadgets as well, like the hilariously underused warp pad or the refractor for some optional tough challenges. The possibilities are literally endless. But no. While they could have easily made them something special, they instead gave us the same 6 rooms on repeat. I do of course realize that this is a matter of time and that you need to prioritize what to work on within your given time frame. What I don't understand is how anyone would prioritize something like the Quark vidcomics or the Thera guys over something that actually works within the game's core gameplay loop. It's either a complete mismanagement of time or a lack of understanding of what makes these games fun. Thinking back, most of the gadgets in the previous games weren't all that fun to use either. The Hydro Displacer instantly comes to mind as a giant flop, the Infiltrator also. Actually, the different puzzles in past games were either mostly okay or horrible wastes of time. I think the only reason they went over as well as they did in the first game was because it was sort of a novelty, and they also struck a pretty good balance where you got to spend more time on the puzzle parts without getting overly interrupted in the middle of them, focusing more on the platform and puzzle aspect than future entries. They were starting to teeter on the edge of this balance in Going Commando, not only by having way too many gadgets taking up way too much space throughout the game, but also by slightly shifting the gameplay focus over towards something a bit more action-oriented. And that is the core of the problem with the gadgets and puzzles in Up Your Arsenal. The pacing and execution of puzzle sections are mostly unchanged from the first game, yet the core gameplay has become faster and more frantic, so whenever it's time to do some puzzles, you end up with a bad case of virtual whiplash from the pace screeching to a halt. They tried to negate this by placing more enemy encounters within the puzzle zones, but the only effect that has is that the whiplash effect is even more pronounced, since you'll actively change modes from combat to puzzle solving and the other way around at multiple points in a short amount of time. It feels like these sections were something that the team decided was a core part of the series and couldn't let them go, but they had the same problem here as with the weapons they brought over from past games. They're not properly adjusted to fit into the new status quo. The puzzles might have worked better if they were more complex and engaging, but their focus groups had trouble with the harder versions, and as such they were dumbed down to what we have today. Keep in mind though that the target demographic for Ratchet and Clank games has always been kids, so the ones in the focus groups were at most around 10 years old, I'd guess. Part of me wants to call BS on the puzzles being too hard for them and rather call them poorly designed, but whatever. I also think the overall difficulty seems a bit extreme for a 10-year-old, but it's hard to put myself in a kid's shoes like that. Mostly because they're really small, but also since it depends a lot on the kid, I guess. The most extreme example being the last boss, but let's take this chance to work our way down from the beginning, shall we? The first boss you encounter is on Florana, and it's Captain Quark. Yeah, honestly, it's about time we had a one-on-one with this guy. For all the shit he's put us through so far in the series, it's a wonder how this hasn't happened until now. It's just a shame that while his body is Quark, his mind isn't, as I think he's supposed to believe he's a monkey throughout all of this, though oddly he only behaves like one after you beat him, so I don't know. Anyways, since he believes he's a native of Florana, he has similar attacks to that of the enemies you've run into previously. He's most notable, and probably only one, being the boomerang that he throws at odd angles. Yeah, this thing has a pretty weird trajectory that's not intuitive at all, and as such, it's easy to get hit by it. Like I said, the enemies also use this thing, but for some reason it feels way more unpredictable when the same attack is used by Quark. It also has a much longer range, I believe, so while you do get a little bit of time to get used to the attacks beforehand, they're not quite the same. He also summons some enemies when you've brought his HP down to a certain threshold, but they're just normal enemies. Quark himself can be kinda tough. He can take a full 8 shots of the nitro launcher and still have a third of his health left, leaving you to either have to go collect more ammo from the crates spawning around the arena or use a different weapon. This isn't that much of an issue, though it would have been if you didn't have the nitro launcher, since the other weapons won't deal very much damage to him. I guess that's why they put out so many ammo crates. It's not an especially tough battle, though it does ask you to be able to use weapons effectively while jumping, since his boomerang attacks are unrelenting. He just keeps throwing them tirelessly. The next non-optional fight takes place on Tyrannosis, the home planet of the Tyrannoids, and is against the Mama Tyrannoid. No, I'm not putting a spin on the boss name, that's the actual one they went for. And no, this is not the final boss. We'll get to discussing the story implications this fight introduces a bit later. Anyways, this is pretty much a copy of the Blodgien Snagglebeast, just without the overly complicated escort section, which has instead been replaced with a slow chase section. The chase scene is nothing more than okay, but I can appreciate the technical skill on display throughout the fight. I mean, that slow-mo section and the camera slowly panning behind the boss before the chase phase, while weirdly out of place, is still really cool. The fight itself is also very okay. It's mostly the same as Quark's fight, where you'll need to jump and fire weapons simultaneously, though this time you'll also need to move around the arena as the boss is actively chasing you. In that sense, it's a natural progression from the previous fight. Add in a sweeping attack from the turret on its back and you have a bit of difficulty, though not until the second phase after you move around and back to the arena after the chase scene. At this point, the boss will have destroyed the 2 pillars in the middle that you could hide behind during the sweeping attack, and also adds another stream of shots. Another great example of natural difficulty progression within a fight. I don't know though, maybe it's the color palette, but I've never been that big of a fan of this boss. There's a bit too much spectacle and it carries a lot of story weight that I don't feel is ever resolved. Don't get me wrong, I think it's a good fight, it does virtually everything correctly, I just don't like most of what surrounds it. I'm not sure if I should categorize the fighter ship or whatever on Dax as a boss, but it has the special health bar, so fine, I guess. This fight is a very direct continuation of the Mama Tyrannoid one, having the boss using very similar attacks. The only real difference this time is that you'll need to be a bit wary of your surroundings. Well, it's not that big of a deal to be honest, but avoiding walking on the floating fan platforms while he's firing the targeted rockets at you will keep them from being destroyed, which gives you a much larger space to use when avoiding the other attacks, both of which are sweeping laser attacks that you need to jump over. He's also very fond of disappearing briefly, which could have made for at least a slight test of directional awareness, but he just ends up reappearing right in front of you after a couple of seconds. The only effect this has is that it removes your lock-on and pauses the action for a bit, making the fight feel like it drags on for far longer than it needs to. Next up is Scorpio, though there's also 2 more bosses in the arena that are optional. Gary and Helen? Great names, just great job guys. These 2 are tag teaming Ratchet. Oh, now I get why their names are German. Right. They essentially change places whenever you deal enough damage to the one in the arena at the time, which makes this a very dynamic boss battle where you'll need to quickly change between different tactics on the fly depending on who's currently fighting. They'll even combine their attacks when Helen is on her last leg. Gary has a multi-target rocket launcher that will hit the ground on a small delay and a Gatling gun. Helen uses a whip and a butt stomp that sends out shockwaves. These 2 perfectly complement each other, where you'll need movement skills to avoid Gary's attack and jumping skills to avoid Helen's attacks, and when they combine their attacks it gets especially spicy. The only real problem I have with these guys is that you can pretty easily cheese them by doing all the other arena challenges first and level your weapons or buy more powerful ones, which makes these 2 a total walk in the park. If you decided to try this challenge before Tyrannosis, Gary and Helen act like a middle ground between Quark and the Mama Tyrannoid. You'll probably still get by even if you don't do the arena stuff, but it makes the transition a little bit smoother, which is why it's kind of a shame that these bosses are completely optional. That's not the case with Scorpio though. You'll need to beat this dude in order to have Courtney Gears join you at All Star Studios. This boss has 2 attacks, both are ranged, so if you can keep your distance, they're easier to dodge, or in the case of a flamethrower, avoid completely. This is what I recommend doing, since the flamethrowers especially can be hard to avoid. It fires 2 of them at once, one near the ground and one in the air, and they move left to right separately from each other, overlapping only near the middle of the boss. This makes it so that you're punished for jumping over the bottom one too early or too late, but the fire behaves kind of erratically and it's hard to tell when you won't get damaged by it, so it's best to just avoid the attack altogether. Scorpio's second attack is planting saw blades into the ground and letting them rip towards you. They're easy to avoid though. This fight is yet again a natural progression in difficulty from the Mama Theronoid. It's not like it's super easy to keep your distance since it takes place on a relatively small and round arena, so unless you know about his attacks beforehand, you'll end up forced into close quarters combat since he also actively pursues you. His attacks are much harder to avoid than the Theronoids, but when he does hit you, he temporarily stops the attack to appeal to the crowd. That's both nice and annoying. From one robot to another, the next boss fight is against Courtney Gears herself. I really like this one, though I might be a bit biased because of the music. There's a lot of stuff going on here, from cage dancing robots to projectile attacks to wide shockwaves traveling along the ground. The fight essentially challenges you to do everything from jumping to mob control and even spatial awareness, since Courtney can teleport around either from cage to cage or in the actual arena itself. You are helped out a bit by the camera trying to follow her around though. You do still need to keep your eyes peeled because unlike the fighter jet, she can actually teleport out of sight and will start to attack you even from behind if you lose track of her by moving the camera. The attacks aren't hard to avoid, but a lot of times you'll have to deal with the melee attacking backup dancers at the same time, which adds an extra thing to juggle. She can be kinda easy to cheese though, since she has a habit of standing in the same place a lot, especially when she's attacking from inside one of the cages. I think I managed to get her down to about 50% in one of these instances, which isn't that bad to be honest, but it seems like this was done to give the player at least a little bit of time to damage her if her constant teleporting proved too hard to react to. It's not like she'll always be standing still either. She also has a pirouette attack that she can keep doing for a prolonged time, giving you something more engaging to dodge too. This kind of changing modes also gives the player an opportunity to change weapons, using ranged ones while she's in the cages and close combat ones while she's on the arena. This is Ratchet and Clank though, so odds are you're probably using weapons that can reach her either way, so I'm not even sure why I brought this up as a point, honestly. Anyways, the next boss is a robot too. Hey, what's up with that, am I right? It's almost like we're actively working against a robot mastermind set on galaxy-wide robot superiority. It's Giant Clank. Clunk. This fight is special in that it takes place on the train in Metropolis from Ratchet and Clank 1. This means that the platforms you are on are narrower than previous battles, which gives you less room to maneuver. They also thankfully fixed most of the collision and physics issues from the first game. Mostly. A second train arrives later when Clunk reaches about 50% HP, though the fight doesn't really change a lot because of it. There's naturally a lot of platforming here since you'll have to jump across the train platforms to reach the boss, who also has this energy ball he'll throw into the air, which will explode in a circular shockwave blast that grows outward parallel to the ground, and you'll need to jump over that one too. It's not a hard boss by any means, mostly thanks to how you'll stand within the confines of the platform when performing side and back flips, making it much harder to make a bad jump and fall off the side. This makes it kinda easy to avoid the attacks, which other than the energy ball mostly consists of Clunk shooting rockets at you, an attack that, in my opinion, ironically gets much easier to avoid when the second train arrives, but it also allows him to shoot the rockets more freely, so there is a slight change to his attack patterns. You'll also start to aim the energy balls in the middle of the platforms, which makes the timing required to jump over the shockwaves a bit harder. This attack is here mostly to prepare the player for the same attack, only much more aggressive, being used by Nefarious, the last boss of the game. This guy is a fucking tank, not only in the a lot of health sense, but also in the holy shit that hurt sense. As every good last boss, Dr. Nefarious is the culmination of every boss mechanic so far. He has a multitude of different attacks, all requiring different methods of movement to dodge. During his first phase, he'll use 3 of them in a pattern. First, he'll summon a bunch of holograms that will charge against you. These aren't hard to dodge at all. You really only need to strafe either left or right without stopping during the entire attack and you'll be okay. The second attack has him side flip before shooting out some laser beams in a swiping motion. Also not very hard to dodge as the lasers will only travel a little bit outwards from him, so as long as you're about the same distance away from him as you were at the start of the battle, you'll be mostly okay. It's pretty hard to dodge this attack if you're within range though, since it covers a very large area. The third attack is by far the most deadly one. He'll throw bombs up in the air at slightly varying intervals, which when they hit the ground will create some huge shockwaves that needs to be jumped over. Not only is the timing for this attack really weird, but you can't see the bombs he throws very clearly, so you'll need to be on your A game constantly while this is going on. You can easily get hit by this attack again and again if you're not careful, and it'll drain your health super fast. This pattern only goes on until you've gotten him down to 4/5 of his total health though, after which he'll throw up a barrier and fly away as enemies spawn in and start shooting you. You don't actually have to destroy these, and honestly it's kinda recommended not to since you'll need the ammo, but there are ammunition crates along the way to help with that. The enemies aren't the only thing in your way though, since the Nefarious will constantly bombard you with a new laser attack and some targeted missiles raining down from above. It's a spectacle, that's for sure. There's no way to damage him during this phase, so your only option is to fight, or run, to the end where he'll finally shut off the barrier and go to town on you. This is hard, and it becomes pretty clear very fast that everything leading up to this was just a warm-up. He'll still attack in patterns, but his pattern is way more varied and aggressive than the last one. Like, he actually starts off throwing out those shockwave bombs. Directly afterwards, actually he'll often start his next attack directly after throwing out the last bomb, which makes it not only hard to react and dodge the following attack, but also the shockwave. Anyways, after throwing out the last bomb, he'll start doing his holographic projection attack again, only this time it'll be wider and harder to avoid, or, when he's low on health, place them throughout the arena and have them come at you one after one until they run out. After this, he flips and does the swiping laser attack. The flip itself is at this point actually a pretty important tell for when he's about to unleash that specific attack, since you'll most likely be closer to him during this phase due to avoiding the different attacks. After this, he jumps into the air and produces these purple laser beams that will follow you around the arena, and also sometimes releases a bunch of those targeted missiles before he lands and does the pattern all over again, starting with the shockwave bombs. Not only is this fight intense, but it's also really well designed. You start off with basically a short instance where you learn how his attacks work, either during that first arena fight or the chase scene. They're all demonstrated properly before they're combined into one long sequence during the last showdown. It's a hard fight, and that's really refreshing. Yeah, despite how he's portrayed in the story, Dr. Nefarious is actually pretty badass. It's a worthy last boss fight with tons of different attacks that needs to be dodged, a chase scene, and an awesome one-on-one finish that completely blows all the other Rack fights out of the water. Yes, even Wreck. Thank God they didn't tack on a boring vehicle segment at the end that kinda ruins the entire build-up leading up to this. Oh no. Yeah, kinda ironic, isn't it, that this game in particular would completely ruin the very last gameplay moment by inserting a sequence that has absolutely nothing to do with the core gameplay at all. Alright, maybe I'm being a bit harsh in saying that it completely ruins it, but it sure does suck a lot of air out of the ending. It's not even hard, or clever, or anything. You just fly a hovercraft around and shoot the bio-obliterator for a few minutes, and that's it. It has some attacks, but they're all easy to avoid, though I think the homing rockets are maybe a bit too hard to dodge. It's not like I ever took enough damage for the aircraft to be destroyed, but it feels like they're impossible to fully avoid sometimes. Also, even if the aircraft were to be destroyed, you're just launched across the air over towards a car, which you can use to drive towards the next ship. There's literally no consequences at play here. And it's so strangely fitting too, right? All throughout the game, you keep encountering these boring battleground sections that shoves you into situations that really doesn't have anything to do with the core gameplay of Ratchet and Clank as we know it, interrupting the quote-unquote normal gameplay before it really gets going. And here we are at the end of the game, right after the best boss fight in the entire series up to this point, and what are we met with? One last interruption, a boring battleground section that doesn't have anything to do with what we just accomplished against Nefarious. It's almost poetic in a way. I guess it wasn't enough for our two heroes to best the main villain in a one-on-one fight to the death. No, the writers had to include a giant mech too. And for what? For Quark to come in at the last minute and redeem himself by doing absolutely nothing? To be able to fit in this genius bit of comedy?
Reactor detonation in 60 seconds.
Lawrence, engage the teleporter.
Would you care to specify a destination, sir?
Who cares? Just get us out of here.
Time's up.
What? That wasn't even close to 60 seconds!
Bye-bye.
Yes, that was sarcasm by the way. The story in most games is not only the backbone of the experience, but also the backbone of the gameplay itself. Now, in a lot of cases, it's really hard to determine if the game design affects the story or vice versa, and Ouya isn't an exception here. So keep that in the back of your mind as we take a look at the overall story. I guess I'll say that, and especially back during when this game was made, the story in games was usually not prioritized very much, but rather something that was shoved in the background during development, having only loose ties to the other elements surrounding the game. Then again, this is also around when that trend started to shift a bit with games like Shadow of the Colossus and the Kingdom Hearts series coming to mind. But the question of the chicken or the egg should always be thoroughly examined before making any conclusions, if you're gonna make any conclusions at all. Anyways, I bet you can tell that I've been looking forward to digging into this, so let's start off at the beginning. We meet back up with the duo in Clank's apartment in Megapolis in the Bogon Galaxy, where they're playing a round of some sort of chess. Probably some foreign version. Before we get a look at Clank's new day job. Apparently he's become a movie star between going commando and up your arsenal. Well, I guess someone has to pay for the penthouse apartment, cause I don't see Ratchet doing any work. Oh, never mind, he's a chauffeur. Fitting. What's even more amazing is that we get to see just how many movies he starred in a bit later, and holy shit, either it's been like 20 years between now and then, or he's been practically working 24-hour shifts. I mean, look at this, it's an entire wall of DVDs. Anyway, the channel is changed to channel 64, which is showing a report from the surface of Veldin, which is currently being attacked by an invading force of Theronoids. Pay attention though, because this two-word tidbit about someone named Dr. Nefarious is the only explanation you'll get of who might be behind these invasions. Once on Veldin, the duo meets up with a couple of Galactic Ranger bots, and already here the story is starting to take a turn compared to the previous games. Just like in the first game, Veldin is used as a call to action here, because apparently that's the only way to get Ratchet to want to do something. That, or have him be bored out of his mind, I guess. There's not really anything pushing him to act after he saved Veldin though. There's the call from who I believe is supposed to be the president of the entire Solana galaxy, but there's never any motive established for why they decide to help. Not like there was in the previous games at least. Ratchet and Clank just kinda goes along with everything, almost never stopping to question why or even comment on the ridiculous situations they find themselves in. Even after the mysterious figure on Florana turns out to be Captain Quark, which, oh wow, who would have guessed, a figure that's been a constant source of misfortune for them for the past 2 games, the reaction is,
Captain Quark? Yeah, Captain Quark! That's it, Quark. You've had this coming for a long time.
and then it's all forgotten. Granted, the dude does think he's a monkey, but what's up with him being able to speak before you fight him and not afterwards? I guess it's the result of getting hit with too many nitro launcher shots to the noggin. After this, we're introduced to the second new character of the game, Sasha, the commander of the Starship Phoenix and also the daughter of the president. She invites the group back to the Phoenix to see if they can do something to fix Quark, and when they arrive, they continue to kill off Ratchet's character by having him admit to being a gamer.
A VG-9000?
Afterwards, a distress call from Arcadia gets cut off by Nefarious himself, announcing that he's about to disintegrate all organic lifeforms. I'm not sure why exactly they decided to include this cutscene. It doesn't really serve any purpose at all other than this sign language interpreter joke that's probably considered too insensitive nowadays. The cutscene is kind of funny though, but you could easily cut it out and no one would notice. Not a single character reacts to it and there's no new information given out. I mean, it's fine that they included it, it's nice to have some sort of reference for who Dr. Nefarious actually is, but at least have someone say something about it instead of making it seem like this was all something that went on in Ratchet's head. Either way, Arcadia is liberated and we meet Al again in a cutscene where Ratchet has the gall to call Clank a nerd. It seems like they're insinuating that Al's playing the Quark vidcomic on the Laser Shield defense terminal, but apparently Clank's advice helps him fix the shield, so like was Al playing the game the reason the shield was down, or was he just slacking? This cutscene is kinda confusing. Anyways, they get the vidcomic and go back to the starship to play it for Quark in hopes that it'll kickstart his memories. I've already talked about how I don't like these from a gameplay perspective, but by far the best thing about them are the cutscenes. They all show a semi-coherent backstory detailing what Quark was up to before the events of Ratchet and Clank 1, essentially explaining how he became a galaxy-renowned superhero. It's also stated that no one believes this is actually how things went down, but honestly it's more fun to imagine that it's mostly true. After all, he did rise to stardom somehow. Watching back the regaling of his former exploits does the trick and Quark regains his memories, but while he's getting his act together, Yeah, right. Ratchet and Clank take a detour to Annihilation Nation to win the Thera guys, which they'll need to infiltrate Nefarious' underwater base in Aquatos. The plan of which has been orchestrated by Quark himself by using every relevant skill of the newly formed Q-Force, a group of returning characters from the first game. Like Quark says, their skills are all vital for the upcoming missions, from Al's ability to speak nerd, to Skid McMarx's disposableness, to Helga's, to Ratchet's plot armor. These are all very important characters that will definitely play a huge role and really help out in the coming battles. Jokes aside, I actually really like Skid. I think he's probably the best character in the game, at least the funniest. And of course, the best part about these plans are Quark's drawings and ability to put Ratchet through as much shit, literally, as humanly possible. I'm so glad these drawings made a return, you have no idea. It's also at this point you're able to experience the next part of the Quark vidcomic series. And this time we're not only touching on the captain himself, but also Nefarious before he was a robot, and most interestingly, it also gives a bit of backstory as to why Blackwater City was swarming with those green amoeboids back when we visited the first time. Turns out it was the good doctor himself who created them. Oh yeah, and we get even more drawings. I love it. Turns out, Nefarious and Quark has a long-running rivalry. Anyways, on the way to Aquatos, the director of the Secret Agent Clank series calls in to try to get Clank to come into the set to film a new movie. I think this is the only time there's ever a cutscene like this in Ouya that's more there for world building than anything else. The cutscenes with characters you meet in Ouya are usually there for the sake of telling you what to do next and further the plot with a couple of jokes here and there, but they rarely use the chance to comment on the state of things or about the surroundings at all. I mean, the director is building up to something that happens later, but cutscenes like this makes the game feel more alive. It also gives more layers to Clank's character, which is much needed. Oh yeah, and it also has bar none the best line in the entire game.
You're breaking up.
You know, I can see you, weasel boy.
On Aquatos, the duo meets up with Skid, who shortly after pisses his pants and runs home. Not because of the giant green blobs of monstrous goo or the big robots that are shooting at him, but because there's someone trying to get their attention in a seemingly empty room. A guy can only handle so much, right? The one trying to get their attention is none other than Slim Cognito, who will give away Megacorp weapons for free. What a swell guy. I really like the reason for him being there too. It's very in character. Further into Aquatos, the duo splits up and, well, I don't know, something about this cutscene in particular doesn't feel quite right. It's something about the delivery and also the way Clank is dismissive over Ratchet's problems with the Thera guys. I know they're friends, but I don't think Clank is saying "it was nice knowing you" in a playful manner in this instance, and it doesn't come across as if he's so confident in Ratchet's abilities that he isn't worried either. It's almost like he literally doesn't care about his well-being. Oh well, at least this is the only cutscene that sows doubt in their relationship. Right? After searching through Nefarious' office, finding a decrypted star map and jumping down into the sewers to escape, they meet the plumber. He's not actually relevant to the plot, and to be fair, he wasn't in Going Commando either, but at least this time he's placed along the main path. He's kinda lost his soul a bit though, even slightly breaking the fourth wall by pointing out that they're right on schedule and then unceremoniously making his exit after the last zero crystal has been turned in. It's almost like his work has finally gotten to him because he's severely lacking in energy. I guess he burnt himself out in the course of 1 and 2 to be able to amass the riches required to buy every one of the Zero crystals. Remember, he used to not have enough bolts to leave a planet that was under attack even. I don't know what the hourly rate for a plumber is in the Solana galaxy, but around these parts, that'd require at least 2 days of work. Maybe 3. Anyways, after this we get a look at Nefarious' work ethic. It sucks. With this cutscene in particular, the jokes keep jumping back and forth between target audiences, which is why I think a lot of the humor doesn't work, and this is true for later in the game too. They start off with a penetration joke. At least I think it's supposed to be a joke, and then end off with a joke about Lawrence needing to fold Nefarious' underpants, which is so nonsensical that I'm having trouble not imagining the writer's kid adding that last part while he was away from the computer for a second, and then they didn't catch it until it was too late. Then we cut back to the Phoenix where Quark, of course, takes all the credit for the plan having gone smoothly. To his credit though, he did plan it all, and it seems he wasn't just sitting around doing nothing while Ratchet was down on Aquatos either, because he's already drawn up a new plan for how to take down the Theranoids. Once and for all even. I really like how he keeps drawing himself in the background as if he's actually going to be taking part in any of this. To everyone's surprise though, he actually deals the killing blow to the Mama Theronoid, which rightfully so earns him an interview from Darla. From a story perspective, this part introduces a huge plot hole, but just keep that in mind for a little bit later. I fucking love this cutscene though, it captures the essence of Quark at its peak. It's also fun watching Ratchet retell the encounter later, which is why it's such a shame that it's interrupted by these two oafs. I just don't understand why Nefarious keeps taunting the Q-Force. There's been little to no plot relevancy any of the times he's appeared so far. It's all because they need a trigger event for the crew to go to the next location, and it feels kinda shallow at points because of that. Al's able to track the transmission to Dax and manages to pull out this cold turkey of a cutscene, which yet again continues to paint Dr. Nefarious as the most simple-minded being in the galaxy.
How do you respond to critics who say your latest galactic schemes are just more of the same?
I will annihilate them!
On Dax, they figure out two things. 1. Ratchet wants some Ruzzy, and 2. Nefarious is constructing some sort of superweapon. Oh wait, we already knew that from the Supervillain Weekly interview. First of all, that Courtney Gears video is like a legit good music video, and also this moment right afterwards highlights the strength of cutscenes being played in-engine. Some of them are pre-rendered, like basically anything that doesn't take place on the planet you're currently on, but most of them are in-engine like this. This means that Ratchet's looks will be the same during normal gameplay segments, be that the armor or, more importantly, the skins. You can unlock skins by buying them with titanium bolts, and this is by far the best cutscene to utilize them in. Fucking hell, I am so glad this isn't pre-rendered. I even made a save before this exact moment so I could put on the best ones and rewatch the cutscene. I guess that's one thing the game lacks, the ability to rewatch them. Pretty sure the other games had that, but don't quote me on it. Alright, so this is where the story forks a bit. You can choose to either pursue the lead on the Bio-Obliterator, or you can choose to pursue that booty. I think the game makes it pretty clear on what it wants you to do first by autoplaying this cutscene with Skid the moment you jump into the ship, saying he'll meet you at the Obani Moons, but nevertheless the choice is yours. It does make more sense this way from a story perspective, since you ultimately leave him at the end of the level for him to try and open the force field as you're driving off to defend Blackwater City. Also, later, after having Courtney Gears agree to spill Nefarious' secrets for a role in the next Secret Agent Clank film, which she doesn't even show up in until after the filming is done and subsequently zaps Clank and replaces him with a replica, Skid is captured by Gears and turned into a robot by a prototype Bio-Obliterator. By the way, why doesn't she react to Clank this way when she gives Ratchet the Thorough-Guys? Anyways, the proximity of events is why I think it makes more sense to do the Obani Moons first, but also since Holostar Studios establishes Courtney as not only an ally, but a close ally to Nefarious, and also gives her closer proximity to the plot than it would if you went and did Blackwater City and the Moons after this. It's also easy to imagine her traveling directly from Nefarious' lair to the moon, since that specific cutscene where Skid gets captured doesn't trigger until after you've finished both Holostar Studios and Blackwater City. It's a shame about Skid though, because this is the last we'll see of him, and he's honestly the funniest written character in the game. Like, the best line belongs to the film director, but the next 5 or so down the list is all Skid. The dude's a comedy goldmine.
Skid? What are you doing here?
My code name is Shadow Dude, bro. Black Ops are my especiality. I figured you guys could use my help.
Uh-oh. Were you spotted?
No way, man. I've been staying out of sight, keeping a low profile. I'm like a shadow, dude.
And you're sure it was her?
Totally. She even autographed my t-shirt.
Ah.
Cover me. Oh, man down.
It's all right, Skid. The fight's over.
Yes. No. That blows, man. I would have been here sooner, but I encountered some heavy-duty resistance.
Enemy troops?
Well, not exactly. The drive through a Galaxy Burger was wicked slow, and...
Anyway, looks like that last moon is surrounded by an Omega-class disintegration field. Whatever's going on out there, it can't be good. If I had the right tools, I could hack into that generator and shut the field down.
Hey, lucky for you dudes, I brought this. Stand back, bro. I'm like a trained professional and stuff. Don't try this at home. Oh, man, it's busted. Oh, wait, never mind.
The animation in these cutscenes also do a lot of the heavy lifting. Anyways, after Sasha tracks down the Leviathan, the ship tipped off to the gang by fake Clank, Ratchet meets up with Quark in order to infiltrate it. Unsurprisingly, it was a trap all along, and Nefarious activates the self-destruct system once the gang is deep enough into the ship. Very surprisingly, Quark puts his life on the line to recover something, which results in him not reaching the escape shuttle in time, presumably blowing up along with the ship after Clank prematurely presses the release button on the pod. Yeah. Afterwards, there's a funeral on the Phoenix, and this is one of the best cutscenes of the entire game. It's full of great lines. I think the cutscenes in general takes a little while to really get going, and it's at this point that I feel they've finally found their stride. From here on out, it's all great. After playing through the 4th vidcomic, the gang figures out that the next target on Nefarious's list is bound to be Metropolis. What meets them there when they arrive is a full-scale Theronoid invasion. Okay, let's get this out of the way. Remember how Quark's plan on Theranos included stopping the entire Theronoid race once and for all? What happened to that? We literally defeated their mother, or queen, or whatever, so where are all these guys coming from? Their main base was destroyed. This is something that is never explained, and you keep running into Theronoids as late as the last level of the game, so there's obviously something that went wrong here, yet it's never brought up. The characters doesn't even react to when the supposedly wiped out Theronoids suddenly appears in Blackwater City, or outside the film studio, or in Iridia, or wherever. There's also the big question of where their allegiance lies. Are they working for Nefarious? There's only one tiny piece of information that hints towards it, which is the line said by Darla during the opening cutscene, and after that, there's nothing. Not a word. The only other thing I can think of is that the Theronoids act as guards in Nefarious' secret base on Aquatos. Though you wouldn't think that Nefarious, the guy who hates biological life forms so much that he's intent on turning the population of an entire galaxy into robots, would ally himself with squishies, right? I guess afterwards, when they've all been robotized, it makes a little sense, but at that point they'd be under his command regardless, and there's no rhyme or reason as to why he's attacking the planets either. It's not for resources like with Drek, and it's not for economic gain, so then why? Wouldn't it be better to just lay low until the superweapon finished construction and then start attacking? Maybe I'm thinking too hard about it, but it's the biggest plot hole in the game, and it's always bothered me how there's seemingly no relation between the Theronoids and Nefarious, which makes them seem like nothing more than superficial enemies that are placed there merely as cannon fodder, something for the player to fight. And that would have been fine if that was their stated purpose in-game. Instead, their involvement is shrouded in questions of why, where, and how. Anyways, at the end of Metropolis, it's finally revealed to Ratchet that the Clank he's been traveling with since Hollow Star Studios is fake. Yeah, okay, so I'm gonna pull up an article right here of an interview that was made internally by Sony, asking some of the developers questions about this game before its release, and I'd like to bring your attention to this one question in particular. How does Ratchet and Clank's relationship progress in Ratchet and Clank 3? The friendship between Ratchet and Clank is stronger than ever. Yeah, right. The difference between Clank and Clunk is nothing short of striking and should be noticed, especially by Ratchet, the moment he decides to release the escape pod without waiting for Quark, or what he was about to say during the funeral.
What a load of bullshit.
Or when he's staring directly into his red glowing eyes. Yeah, because Clank's eyes have been glowing red all the time before this, right? Jesus Christ, I thought these two were supposed to know each other. I do like the writing in this game, it's much more coherent than the other two, but stuff like this instantly breaks it apart at the seams. It's just not believable for Ratchet to not react with suspicion after Clank suddenly completely changes traits like this. And then, what was even the point? You could argue that his end goal was bringing down Quark, but why even bother? Nefarious even admits that he thinks Quark is nothing but a stupid imbecile, so I don't think he ever actually considers him a threat. You could argue that he wanted to find out where the Q-Force was stationed, but remember, he already knew that, or else he'd have no idea where to send that holographic telegram near the beginning of the game. Even if he wanted to just get rid of Ratchet, he could have easily just had Clunk literally stab him in the back at any time instead of luring him into a death battle with Clunk, which Ratchet wins, of course. Meanwhile, Nefarious announces his plans to carry out identical attacks throughout the galaxy, and in the Q-Force's desperate attempts to stop them, they realize that whatever Quark went back for on the Leviathan before it exploded might still be along the wreckage of the ship back on Celdran. Not only do they find the data disk they were looking for, but they also find, to no one's surprise, an escape pod with a recording of Quark on it. Yeah, turns out he survived after all. Him and his, pocket crotchetizer. Maybe he should have just died, actually. After having saved Iridia from another full-scale Theronoid assault, our heroes turns in the data disk to Al and plays through a previously secret issue of the Quark vidcomics. This one's narrated by Slim Cognito. Fittingly, since during the last part of the 4th vidcomic, Quark killed the previous narrator when he tried to continue the story.
Seems the script is missing a few pages.
Thanks, Professor. I'll take it from here.
This last issue details what Quark was up to after he escaped from Nefarious' secret lair. Why exactly it took Nefarious 2 games for him to continue his campaign after this, I don't know. But that's not the purpose of this vidcomic. Rather, it's to reveal Quark's hidden base on the Thran asteroid, where he's doing absolutely nothing but sitting around in his PJs. His entire speech here about suddenly realizing he's not invincible is frankly pure bullshit, and the only reason they included it was so he could have his heroic redemption during the last boss fight, where he does absolutely nothing. It's a straight up lie that him almost exploding along with the Star Cruiser was what made him realize that he's a coward, because that's simply not his character. He wants to be the hero, desperately, even to the point of allying himself with a world-destroying maniac or setting loose a deadly experiment for him to stop all by himself. The Quark we've seen portrayed so far, even in this very game, is that same Quark. It's just that he doesn't want to do any of the work. He literally takes the easiest route possible towards stardom, and even then, he did actually join Ratchet and Clank on the fucking Leviathan mission, despite knowing it was going to be dangerous. And he faced Nefarious without as much as a quivering bone in his body. He even went back during a self-destruction sequence because he thought he saw something that could have helped the team. No, I don't buy it. Maybe I'm being presumptuous, but I'm just going to come out and say it. This is bad character writing. The Quark we've seen up to this point would 100% return to the Phoenix and witness his own funeral just to hear the crew praising him before revealing his discovery and the tale of how he survived despite the overwhelming odds. Simply because that's how much of a narcissist he is. This piece of shit portrayal of one of the best characters in the PS2 trilogy, one of the strongest driving forces behind everything that has happened so far, is not acceptable. It doesn't help that this is the last time Quark has any important relevance in the series except for being a comic relief from a Saturday morning children's show either. So yeah, I'm disappointed. And even though he does retain most of what makes him so good during the early game, they're really doubling down on Quark's egocentric trait for the most part in his cutscenes. But they're also intent on portraying him as, well, a dumbass. I don't like that. I mean, Quark was always kind of a goofy dude, but he did after all fool the duo in the first game and put up a good enough act to fool people into thinking he was actually Fizzwidget in the second. And while he was never portrayed as smart, I still don't think he gets enough credit throughout Up Your Arsenal, and that feeling is cemented right here. They really did Quark dirty in this one. After some well-chosen words from Clank that will ensure Quark's return later, the duo finds out that the Phoenix is under attack and goes back to rescue their crew. Apparently the data disk has some crucial information about Nefarious' plans on it. How he figured out that they had it, I don't know, but whatever. Apparently, it contains the entirety of Nefarious' battle plans, which gives him an opportunity to finally destroy the Bio-Obliterator as it's charging on planet Koros. They managed to do just that, but to everyone's surprise, it turns out that there's a second one on planet Mylon. Wait, hang on. Didn't that one news report say Bio-Obliterator? What the fuck? How is this a surprise? Jesus Christ, these people are worthless. They can't even follow the news. Hell, Ratchet even said Bio-Obliterators himself. Whatever. The duo catches up to Nefarious on Mylon. They seemingly defeat him. He enters the last Bio-Obliterator, which turns into a mech, and Quark comes flying in for his moment of redemption and does nothing of note, and Ratchet takes out the mech in a boring air battle. Story over. Cut to outro that has nothing to do with the rest of the game whatsoever. Listen, I know this is hard to believe, but like I said, I like the story as a whole. It's at least somewhat coherent compared to the one in Going Commando. I think Brad Santos did a great job considering Up Your Arsenal was his first project as lead writer, at least according to his LinkedIn page. The cutscenes flow well, the voice acting is for the most part excellent, and the animation is always on point, and I think we have him doing a good job directing to thank for that. The one thing I don't like though is that for the most part, this doesn't feel like an adventure anymore. Sure, a lot of that is down to the story being more centered around the war against the Theranoids and Nefarious, but there's also how you're no longer meeting new and interesting characters at the end of most routes. In Rack 1 and 2, you keep meeting the inhabitants of the planets you visited, who not only would further the story and send you on your way, but also comment on what was going on around them. For Ouya, these characters are replaced by either generic robots for all of the battleground segments, or returning characters, or no one at all for most of the classic levels. Even items and gadgets, which was previously either given or sold to you by a bunch of unique characters, are now either relegated to the generic Galactic Ranger bots, or just plain found lying around in the middle of nowhere. All these characters being at all these places all the time makes it feel like you're always on the same planet, not jumping between a good handful of them. This also highlights that most of these characters doesn't have a lot of depth to them. Like, it was fine meeting Helga once on Metropolis because she works as a good one-note character, but having her show up frequently when her only defining trait is being German doesn't exactly do her any favors. There's also Dr. Nefarious. I just don't get what people see in this guy. Some have described him as cunning, a worthy adversary for Ratchet, but like, what? Even Quark as Fizzwidget was shown to be more cunning than this. Nefarious' only role in the game is to scream all his lines so that the kids will have something to laugh at when they don't understand the jokes. Not that he has any good ones. I think a lot of people have mistaken Dr. Nefarious for a funny character, when in reality it's the characters around him that makes the jokes. He himself basically just flaunts his cringe everywhere, and like I said, he just keeps
I always hated biology!
Screaming.
Lawrence!
Like in this particular scene with Courtney Gears, for example.
I told you to stop calling me that!
Why? It's disappointing too, because believe it or not, if you look at certain moments in isolation...
Alright, Lawrence, you can turn it off now.
Oh, may I, sir? What a treat.
He's actually pretty funny in like 1 or 2 instances when he doesn't behave like a kid that's in the middle of a sugar high. I guess I thought that calling him a mad scientist meant they could get away with not giving at least a little background on his plans, or actually show him planning them. I mean, I guess he could have assumed the team would be able to track the signal of the transmission he projected onto the Phoenix to Dax, and I suppose it's not impossible for them to find Courtney's music video once they arrived at Dax, and surely it's not that much of a leap in logic to assume they'd successfully fight their way through a deadly arena challenge in order to meet Courtney Gears, who would then capture Clank. But to what end? To meet his big hero? To lure Quark to the space cruiser so that he could blow it up with him in it just to witness his demise? Oh, come on, you've got to be kidding me. I don't know, personally I think Nefarious is portrayed as too much of a bumbling moron to justify any of these theories. As a result, Dr. Nefarious is never really seen as a threat at all until his boss battle, and he's not really in the focus for most of the game either. He honestly seems more like a side character. He just shows up, says some random bullshit, and then leaves without elaborating. The main objective is and will always be taking down Nefarious though, but they're using the invasion and war against the Theranoids as a backdrop. Most of the time though, it feels like the other way around, as the Theranoids are much more in focus until the last few levels. In the previous games, the stories were much more linear. In 1, you were out to find Captain Quark, and subsequently after his betrayal and later his demise, Ratchet and Clank takes it upon themselves to stop Drek. In Going Commando, Ratchet is sent out to retrieve the experimental Protopet prototype, and after giving it to Mr. Fizzwidget, who turns out to be Quark in disguise, has to solve the mess the duo created by tracking down and neutralizing the Protopet. In Up Your Arsenal, Ratchet starts off fighting the Theranoids because of their invasion of Weldon, and then gets roped into stopping Dr. Nefarious, but it's never really explained what his relation to the Theranoids are, so Nefarious and the Theranoids end up feeling like two separate forces. This makes it extra jarring when the Nefarious issue keeps getting sidestepped in order to go stop all the different Theranoid invasions. I get that they were being ambitious, but just like with the rest of the game, it seems like they ended up including more than they should have, especially when most of the characters doesn't have any pre-established relationships between them. This makes it harder to have the characters have any kind of meaningful interactions because they don't know each other, so it will come off as forced. This is a problem that gets more noticeable as the same characters keeps reappearing in scenes with each other but then doesn't interact. Yeah, just take a look at some of the cutscenes. The characters only interact with the one they have pre-existing relationships with. Helga and Al never says a word to Skid, for example. Whenever any of them are talking, it's mostly with Ratchet, or in some rare cases Quark. They do have some funny one-liners if you wait long enough on the command deck on the Phoenix, but that's exactly just that, one-liners. Hell, it's not just the characters in the Q-Force that are neglected. The only ones who even have any meaningful interactions with Clank are Ratchet and Dr. Nefarious. The only relationship they managed to do well by that aren't pre-existing from previous games and doesn't involve Ratchet is with Quark and Nefarious, but they're the ones they spend the most time on, right? I realized how badly expanded upon their relationships of the Q-Force characters was when my only reaction to the Phoenix coming under attack with them inside was, okay, whatever. Even when Ratchet is involved, Sasha being a love interest for him and their kiss comes kinda right out of left field, since they don't really have that many meaningful interactions together before that, and even afterwards, they're acting more like commander and squad member than anything else. It feels shoehorned in just for the sake of having a romantic sub-story. At least some things didn't change. Up Your Arsenal comes off as a project where Insomniac bit off way more than they could chew, even more so than with Going Commando. Listen, it's fine to be ambitious, but at some point you need to take into consideration what's necessary to the core of what you're making. A lot of what they implemented in this game, like the vehicles, the battlegrounds, the items that they threw in for the sake of it, the gadgets, the warpad specifically, some of the weapons, they either serve no purpose and only helps make the game feel bloated, or directly affects the gameplay in a negative way. I believe that a lot of this had to do with their time constraints. When you look at the things like the warp pad, which is used like twice, or the Gadgetron PDA that's just laying out in the middle of nowhere, it's hard to imagine that they had a lot of time to spare. In fact, it seems more like they had to just drop everything they had in their hands and finish the game at the last possible second. Like, I'm sure if they had the time, they'd actually remove the warp pad puzzles, because as they are right now, they're nothing. But apparently they didn't, and I think that's pretty telling. And then there's the weapons and their balancing, not just the power of them, but also the costs. I started a new playthrough from scratch, did all the optional stuff I could, and only bought a few weapons. I even skipped the second armor upgrade, and I still didn't have enough bolts for the Annihilator when it became available. Early game weapons like the shock cannon, plasma whip, and so on becomes laughably powerless within the first half of the game, and maybe that is more because of the devs wanting you to use more than one set of weapons. I'm sure they could have figured out a better method of doing so if they had more time. There's also the blatant weapon reuse from past games, resulting in an arsenal that is mostly composed of weapons you've already used before. And while there is a lot of variety, there's an obvious byproduct of the multiplayer in the form of weapons that carried over, which are too tactical and unfit for the core gameplay of the single player. The multiplayer also seems to have had an effect on the game besides the weapons, in the form of the many battlegrounds. Like I mentioned, it's hard to tell which came first, but I'm sure the inclusion of multiplayer must have had some effect, right? It's pretty easy to tell when you start to notice how many of the stages both of the modes share. They were worked on simultaneously after all, so it would have been an easy way to add content. Like I've said, I think that these stages ultimately hurts the game more than it benefits from them because of how they work and how their mission structures are set up. For the most part, you start at the same point every time and inhabit the same area during each of the challenges as well. It's more like an alternate arena than anything else, except in the arena you're confined to a much smaller space, which makes the action flow better. Well, except for the death courses, that is. I have no idea why they decided to include this many of them. It would have worked much better if there were fewer of them and every challenge was its own thing, instead of the current setup where you're only running along a pre-decided route through rooms that all look the same. Even the reuse of characters might be because they lacked the time to design and create new ones, and they certainly didn't have time to flesh them out, something that's painfully obvious whenever any of the Q-Force crew are in the same cutscene together. I think that my final conclusion is simply that Insomniac spread themselves too thin on this one. They wanted to make their magnum opus, their dream game, the one game to rule them all, yada yada, but they didn't take their extremely limited time budget enough into consideration, which is why we got all these oddities. It's a damn shame, because I think that the parts that they got right, like the cutscenes, most of the weapons, and the classic type levels, are all outstanding, maybe even the best in the entire series. Sadly though, Despite the brilliance of the good parts, they are unable to outshine the bad ones, which in the end makes Up Your Arsenal merely a cautionary tale in game design of how to manage the time given to you and not to try and do everything all at once.